And now, our feature presentation.
Quake is 30, and that is weird. One of the reasons that's weird is because that means that I've been playing this game since the summer I was 13. Seeing it for the very first time on my friend's very expensive Pentium computer, I remember being aghast, wide-eyed at the fully 3D graphics, environments dingy and scabbed with rust and filth. I remember the pinball sound of the grenades as they bounced off of surfaces, the chilling sound of chainsaws and explosions close at hand. I've been hearing these noises in my head with perfect recall since that experience, and I imagine that the last thing I ever hear before I die will be the sound of Quake's grenade launcher in my head. Possibly my wife's voice, but I expect that the final neurons firing will make it sound like Quake grenades. As my friend and I played the game, there was no CD-ROM present, meaning we didn't have access to the oppressive ambient soundtrack by 9 Inch Nails. This meant that the only thing we could listen to were those indelible sound effects, which Trent Reznor had a hand in crafting. He didn't create all of the sound effects for the game, rather the overall sound design, but he did actually perform the voice of Quake's protagonist, Ranger. Every single grunt, groan, gurgle, and gross death came from Trent Reznor's mouth, and as we'll discuss, that recording required monumental effort and the learning of brand new skills. But when we played the game, again, we had no music. That meant it was total silence. Us, the room, and the game. Each clank and creak from doors and floors felt vast and inescapable. The snarls of the fiends before their predator leap, a chilling induction of anxiety. The rapid typewriter staccato of the nail gun, impressive and as present as a jackhammer. When I first played Quake at 13, it was in full absorption of the game's atmosphere, an atmosphere that still surprises me to this day. In that moment, I felt like I had discovered something life-altering, something to surpass even Doom as the greatest shooter of all time. But now, Quake is turning 30, and that's weird. It might be weird due to the reminder of the passage of time, but it's also weird because the game, and the franchise as a whole, feels stuck in a kind of limbo, which honestly has a kind of ironic significance. Quake hasn't had an impactful release in over 20 years. 2005's Quake 4 was the last time that the franchise released an entry which felt important. Since then, there's been the release of a spin-off in 2007 titled Enemy Territory: Quake Wars, a massively multiplayer tactical shooter about the early days of the Strogg War. There's also been Quake Live in 2010, a reworking of the multiplayer-only Quake 3 Arena. And then, most recently, Quake Champions in 2017, a PvP hero shooter designed for modern competitive multiplayer. Of those three, Quake Live is still the most popular today and has undergone any number of evolutions to attain its final form. And while players are few and far between, those who congregate still on its servers do so in strengthened groups. Quake Wars turned off the fandom to such an extent that it isn't even available on digital platforms. Quake Champions, meanwhile, never felt like more than a whisper of potential, a hero-class shooter entry in a famously high-speed arena shooter series. The 2014 release of Wolfenstein: The New Order said to players, "Here, remember Wolfenstein? Here's that, but with modern graphics and gameplay elements." The reboot of Doom in 2016 said, "Hey, remember Doom? Here's that, but with modern graphics and gameplay elements." Quake Champions in 2015 said to players, "Hey, do you like Overwatch? Here's that, but Quake and less good." It entered early access in 2017, and after 5 years, emerged into full release in 2022. In that time, it bobbed up and down softly within the waves of the online PvP scene. Interest renewed once a year around QuakeCon for tournaments, never finding the same player base that Wolfenstein and Doom could. Nowadays, finding a match online is nearly impossible, which only serves to highlight the plight of the franchise. Quake Wars, Quake Live, and Quake Champions were multiplayer-only experiences, focused tightly on competitive PvP gameplay, meaning, coincidentally, there hasn't been a Quake with a single-player campaign in over 20 years. Quake is 30. What once felt like the most important game in the history of first-person shooters sits today languid and distant, decried by some as a series which is long past prime and therefore wouldn't sell copies in today's market. A game whose engine still lines the code of modern graphics engines, now a relic of its time. And yet with the release of the remasters, a slight sea change has begun to turn. Slowly, here and there, Quake's fanbase has been rallying together in the hopes of a reboot along the lines of Doom 2016, all while still conjuring new expansions and mods which push the Quake series to new, glorious, gory heights. Mods and fan expansions have been keeping the series alive since the game's inception, and many of them have held significant impact over the years. Arcane Dimensions, a massive fan expansion to the base game, released in 2015. The Immortal Lock, another mod, is one singular supermassive map released in 2024, which not only contains more enemies than the totality of Quake, its difficulty is tuned to such specificity that it suggests players go through the game on a lower difficulty setting than they're used to. And, most recently in 2026, Quake Brutalist Jam 3 dropped, a collaborative collection of maps made in conjunction with a specific rule set, completely altering the weapons, enemies, soundtrack, and more. While there were 2 other Brutalist jams before this one, this particular entry makes me feel like I'm playing Quake for the very first time all over again. In many ways, it's the best time to be a Quake fan in the past 2 decades, and in other ways, it's quite possibly the most frustrating. Quake, as a series, is in a strange state. In 2016, in celebration of Quake's 20th anniversary, game studio Machine Games released a new fan-made map pack for Quake titled Dimension of the Past, which was then later established as an official expansion when the 2021 remaster of the game by Night Dive released. For this remaster, landing on the 25th anniversary of the game, Machine Games dropped yet another expansion, this one titled Dimension of the Machine. After the remaster and 2 new official expansions, fan expectations for a more proper reboot of the franchise in the vein of Doom 2016 have quietly faded in the distance. Sure, rumors abound, but rumors are ephemeral at best. As these rumors swirl, Machine Games is currently all but confirmed to be developing the 3rd Wolfenstein game in the reboot series, and id Software is currently hard at work on DLC for Doom the Dark Ages, the base game of which notably featured environments and gameplay so similar to the first Quake game that gamers swore up and down that Dark Ages must have originally been meant to be a Quake game, only swapped to the Doom iconography at the last minute. This isn't true, of course, but it is telling how hungry fans of Quake are for a new, proper Quake game that they're willing to grasp at straws when they even glimpse the barest hint of the imagery. Quake is 30. So, as I'm wont to do every now and again, I decided it was time to revisit the game which irrefutably altered my existence, and play it front to back to immerse myself once again within those rusted halls. Each time I play Quake, there's always something new that I take away from it, some little experience here or there, or some sensation that I take note of and find myself chuckling at how there's still new things to experience. Except that this time, playing through the game, I was surprised to discover how angry the game feels. Quake is a game born of strife. To understand why it feels so angry, we have to go back to the beginning once again. As a Quake dad, I've talked about the origins of Quake multiple times in multiple videos, most notably in my video on Quake's 25th anniversary, as well as in my documentary on the making of Daikatana. Each time we return to the topic, there's always something new or interesting or once hidden that has now come to light. As per usual with this go-around, I've got some fascinating new information to add to the discourse. To begin with, however, it starts with Dungeons & Dragons. In the early days of id Software, the original group, John Carmack, John Romero, Tom Hall, Adrian Carmack, Kevin Cloud, all engaged in a detailed, dense campaign authored by John Carmack, within which was a character named Quake. Quake was the ultimate warrior, a badass amongst badasses who carried a massive hammer that conducted bolts of lightning. Fast forward to the end of id's development on Commander Keen. Eager to start developing their next game, John Romero suggested a game built around the character of Quake, in which game progression would subvert the standards of RPG gameplay. Rather than open as a weakling with the intent to gain experience and level up, players would instead control Quake with all his incredible powers and abilities, absolutely destroying every enemy and foe that would rise up against them. The team was positive on this idea, but after running through multiple design scenarios, they all came to the conclusion that the available technology simply couldn't support the type of game that they wanted to make. So, the title, The Fight for Justice, was shelved in the hopes that they could one day return to it. The game that they ended up developing next was Wolfenstein 3D. Then came Doom. Then came Doom 2. As development on Doom 2 came to an end, id Software held another meeting. This time, John Carmack announced his intention to create a new, fully 3D game engine for their next title. Romero saw the opportunity and leaped. It was finally time to make Quake. By this point, there were a few new faces on the team, notably American McGee and Sandy Peterson, who hadn't been around when discussions of Quake first occurred. And animated Romero led them through the pitch, a complex action RPG with fighting game mechanics and an open world. It was an easy sell, and Carmack was fully on board as well. But then something unexpected happened. Carmack couldn't figure out how to get the engine to work the way he wanted. And since he couldn't figure that out, he couldn't provide Romero with specifications on what exactly the engine was capable of. Without knowing that, John Romero couldn't design a game around the engine's properties. And without design, Romero's design team had nothing to do. For about 6 months, Carmack toiled away at the engine, with tensions mounting in the background. Romero, confident that Carmack's work would come together, kept his design team moving with busy work, something that the team quickly became frustrated with. There was no game to work on, just texture ideas and simple 3D spaces to manipulate, no focused endgame. Complaints were raised. The team wanted direction, but Romero had none. Instead, he kept tossing out homework assignments in order to bolster creative juices. Grinding out textures and sound design over and over again took its toll on the team, so much so that when Carmack at last came around to the team again with news that the engine was complete, the team no longer wanted to work on the project that Romero had envisioned. Grinding out a complex game built around innovative design no longer felt surmountable. A number of the team wanted to now make a shooter built around the principles established by Doom, a framework which they already knew and were familiar with, and so could see themselves building to completion. Romero was now the one to be frustrated. He didn't want to step backwards in development style, but rather forwards into something new and incredible. But the clear exhaustion of the team was palpable. Carmack felt the tension, and so he called a vote. Should we make Quake a Doom-style shooter? The vote passed. Romero relented, and so design was redesigned into a first-person shooter rather than an action RPG. Despite the relief of changing the design, the frustrations didn't end. Instead, they sat in the background, escalating, slowly but surely, as development progressed. Adrian Carmack produced a number of Aztec-inspired textures for American McGee to use in his portion of the campaign, only for McGee to ask for an entirely new set of textures because the Aztec set didn't inspire him. He wanted more industrial metal, rough and rusted and harsh. Adrian Carmack seethed at this, having to create something entirely new again, but at Romero's request, he relented. John Carmack at one point decided to pass out letter grades to the staff based on their individual performances up to that point in development. Romero was granted a D grade. No one understood why Carmack had chosen to do this, but by this point, the writing was on the wall. Something was wrong. Development wasn't moving as smoothly as it had in the past. Members of the team were frustrated. Sandy Peterson privately went to Carmack after the letter grading to complain about Romero's lack of focus. Romero saw Carmack as being too dictatorial and that the fun of game creation was leaking out of the office. Then came the war room. In an effort to congregate the entirety of the team into one solid working unit, Carmack tore down the walls of the offices so that no one had a private cubicle any longer. Every member of id Software was working out in the open now, all together, the only personal space left in the form of each person's choice of music that they were listening to on their headphones. Romero and Carmack got into a spat. Romero was accused of not working hard enough on Quake. Romero shot back that he was diversifying the company's income by continuing to keep an eye on production of Hexen and Ultimate Doom. Carmack was unshakable. Still, the work continued. In the midst of all this, another element of the game was coming together: the music and the sound. YouTube channel The Yeti Den has an exceptional video detailing the story of how the soundtrack came together, which I devoured eagerly and will recount the truncated details here. If the subject of all things Quake intrigues you as much as it does me, I highly recommend you watch the full episode. Back in the early part of development, the team at id received a fax. 9 Inch Nails was coming to Dallas, Texas, and id Software was personally invited to the show. Trent Reznor, as it turns out, was a big fan of id Software. He played Spear of Destiny with Chris Vrenna while they were working on the Downward Spiral, and then he played Doom after recording had finished. As a big fan of their brash, artistic vision, Trent wanted to meet the team. And in the midst of that meeting, John Carmack decided to take a big swing. After impressing upon Trent that id Software were also big fans of 9 Inch Nails, Carmack let slip that they were starting a new project, one whose lighting and graphics would make their new game that much closer to the same moodiness that 9 Inch Nails' music felt. Carmack inquired if Reznor would be interested in working on sound for their new game, and to everyone's surprise, he said yes. At this point in time, Trent had a new space established in New Orleans called Nothing Studios, a former mortuary converted into a recording space. Describing his approach as a passion project, not for money or for a new audience, Trent threw himself into the work. Designing the sound was a new experience for him, as he took on the role of the player's gasps, grunts, and groans. Every noise that Ranger makes comes from Trent's throat, which at times during recording became hoarse and ragged from repeating the same screams over and over and over again to the point of nearly vomiting from the effort. Trent also had to learn Foley work in his attempts to replicate the sounds of something getting stabbed. A fellow sound designer let him in on the trick of simply taking a head of lettuce and bashing it with a knife. There are differing reports of how the music itself came to life. Originally, id wanted 9 Inch Nails to produce the sound design, as they'd done research into how top Doom players played the game with the music actually turned off. So id considered leaving music aside, focusing more on creating data space for sound effects and enemy AI. John Carmack tells the story that Trent felt music was missing from the game and wanted to create some tracks for them. Meanwhile, the way Trent sees it is that id came around during the course of production and then asked him to actually make some music after all. However it all came to be, once agreed upon, Trent stated upfront that he wasn't interested in working with MIDI sounds. He wanted to utilize CD quality sound, affording him the ability to work with whatever instruments he wanted. Id agreed, but Trent's record label, Nothing Records, was owned by Interscope, which led to some finicky legal arrangements. No lyrics and no MP3s were what it boiled down to. Id was flustered at the idea of no MP3s, because that meant that the music files, happily contained to the CD-ROM regardless, could now only be played if gamers kept the CD-ROM in their CD-ROM drives while playing the game. It was tricky to work with, and not everyone was happy, but eventually it came together. Meanwhile, the 9 Inch Nails logo on the nailgun ammo pickups was the result of a joke. The nailgun had been a part of gameplay prior to Trent's involvement, but during production, the devs gleefully showed Trent their mock-up of the ammo pickup with the logo, thinking he'd get a chuckle and then they'd change it back. But to their surprise, he loved it so much, he asked them to keep it in. Trent kept the music to a sinister ambiance. The idea was to prevent the music from overpowering the gameplay experience or being too distracting or annoying on a second playthrough. This led to the experiments. The harsh, jagged guitar distortion and pulsing bass woven throughout the score. It's a daunting, oppressive soundtrack, something that Chris Vrenna said was an eye-opening experience into creating game music, an experience which he enjoyed so much that he himself would return for multiple id Software soundtracks, including Doom 3 and Quake 4. Near the end of development on Quake, it's been said that American McGee went AWOL from id's offices, and that no one could find him. His whereabouts are still to this day unaccounted for, or at the very least unreported. But thanks to the video by the Yeti Den, I now have a supposition as to where he was. McGee worked on sound alongside 9 Inch Nails and made multiple trips out to Nothing Studios in New Orleans to check up on progress. At that time, however, 9 Inch Nails were in, to put it delicately, an indulgent atmosphere. Bars don't have a mandatory closing time in New Orleans, so the concept of staying out late, drinking absinthe, and then strolling out into the mid-morning sun, unaware of the passage of time, was not unheard of. McGee, as Vrenna says, took the brunt of these drinking escapades as well as anyone could. For what it's worth, and without anyone to contest this, and please, American McGee, help me out by confirming or denying this, it seems pretty likely that McGee got caught up in the rockstar lifestyle during this portion of development, and it kept him there. All stories of hardship must come to an end, however. Haggard, exhausted, id Software completed Quake. On June 22nd, 1996, the shareware version of Quake went live, an immediate hit. Romero saw the game through to retail release, but then, as he was gathering his options, the final bomb dropped. Carmack fired Romero. Romero at this point had already been considering leaving id, because to him, the joy of creation had evaporated from the staff, but this insult was the final straw. Adrian Carmack and Kevin Cloud were present for the meeting, but they didn't want to be. Romero and Carmack stared each other down, the unstoppable force versus the immovable object. In the end, Romero signed his resignation papers and left. Attempting to condense the entirety of the fraught development of Quake is a frustrating task in and of itself. How on earth can one clearly define and describe the events that led to John fucking Romero getting fired from id Software? What did it feel like to be in that war room? Walls torn down, Pantera and 9 Inch Nails blasting at max decibel through your headphones as you tried to work and ignore the fact that you could see and no doubt smell every single other member of the team around you. What was it like wondering if Carmack was looking over your shoulder, over your work? What was it like to grind out each texture, wireframe, polygon, light source, wondering if it was going to be good enough, or if someone else was going to ask for you to go back and create something completely different? You also have to wonder if anyone knew that this was not going to end well. Was there a sense of encroaching dread? Of something waiting just out of sight, behind closed doors, up in the rafters? What kind of unease hung over the members of id Software as they marched forward day after day, still continuing to work, still continuing to create? If ever there was a team that was personified by their give no shits, let's fucking go attitude towards game development, it was id Software. With Commander Keen, Wolfenstein, and Doom, they could do no wrong. But Quake must have felt wrong. It must have felt nondescript and awkward. If you ask me, and I'm assuming you are because you're here watching this video, then I think that the best way to experience what this atmosphere must have felt like would be to play the game. The world of Quake, or really the worlds, hum with anxiety and ache. It almost feels like a kind of restlessness, as though existing here in this place takes so much effort and will that it causes trembling limbs. I'm surprised at how angry the game is. Angry in the sense of feeling upset that it is forced to exist as though it didn't ask for this outcome, and so reacts with hostility at being forced to interact with. Agony and anguish vibrate throughout the various environments the player must traverse, turning on the player less like a set of antibodies forcing out an intruder, but more like a wounded animal that cannot die. And when I say angry, I don't mean in the sense of hostility towards the player. Obviously, there is conflict. The world of the game versus the player. The antagonists versus the protagonist. The game is rife with violence, and the player is the conduit of that violence. But when I say the game is angry, I don't mean that it approaches the player with a kind of oppression or means to berate or belittle the player. No, the game itself simply feels angry. With each pair of doors that open, a new rush of anguish swarms towards Ranger, eager for the catharsis of release. Punishment is the method of madness here. Multiple enemies have 2 attack animations, one for close quarters, one for distance. Attacks over distance are usually more potent than the melee, so it's wise to close the gap between you and them. But then you're close to them. They attack quicker up close, and often hit multiple times with a single swing. So then it becomes a kind of dance, a tango of intimate infliction, bouncing back and forth in attempts to dodge actions and reactions. When your dance partner is a massive, 10-foot-tall eldritch abomination that shoots lightning from its chest, the steps are important to pay attention to. Quake is divided into 4 episodes, which we can tackle in any order that we desire from the hub map. But before that hub is another hub, a difficulty selection hub, which at least grants us the right to choose the amount of anger we should expect from the game. Appropriately, the hard difficulty is an obstacle in and of itself, with a pool of lava necessary to leap over to reach the teleport, and a writhing zombie crucified overhead. Nightmare selection is even more difficult, a hidden portal that players must seek out intentionally. Once we've chosen our difficulty, then we can choose which of the 4 slipgates representing the 4 episodes to step through and into one of 4 vastly different eldritch dimensions. The introductory map of each episode takes place in a military base on Earth, contained within which is a slipgate that takes us to the specific dimension we'll be venturing through for that episode. The game's manual details the story of how an interdimensional being, codenamed Quake, has been reaching through multiple dimensional portals, the slipgates as previously mentioned, in an attempt to breach through our reality and subsume humanity. The protagonist, Ranger, is a one-man army being sent through the gates to tackle Quake itself in what is codenamed Operation Counter-Strike, going through one world at a time, collecting 4 powerful runes in order to open the final gate and stop the madness from pouring through. As we enter each of these military bases, the effects of Quake's influence are immediately felt. Each complex is comprised of rusted metal walls, coated in pockmarks and stained in places with blood. It doesn't take much for us to infer that some serious shit went down in each of these areas, particularly when we take sight of the enemies within. All of our fellow Marines and even our trained canines have succumbed to the madness of Quake and turned to attack us on sight. All of them. The standard issue grunts, the laser-bearing enforcers, and the snarling Rottweilers are covered in blood. All of them survivors. Or perhaps the victors. Their pained expressions glare at us with shocking bloodlust. Veterans of Doom won't be particularly shocked by this vision alone, with previous experience with the sight of fellow soldiers demonically reanimated into violent zombies. But what's especially interesting about the creative choice in Quake is that human enemies only appear in the military base maps, with the exception of E1M2, Castle of the Damned, the only non-military base map where grunts appear. It could be that using the grunts in Castle of the Damned were meant to act as a transition from human foes to inhuman foes, presenting a delicate mix of the two just once in order to let players know, hey kids, you're not in Kansas anymore, but here's just enough Kansas so there's less whiplash. Still, the military bases act as a snapshot of the alien Quake's influence and a promise of what's to come should we fail our ultimate mission. See, these Marines aren't monsters that came through the slit gates as invaders. These Marines are human beings, driven mad by Quake's influence. It's particularly insidious because that means these Marines turned on their fellows and started killing everyone not under the same spell. They're the victors, or perhaps the survivors. They're not actively trying to leave the base, but rather they're simply subsisting there, wandering the halls, looping about on patrol, mindlessly, perhaps within the last remnants of their sanity, twisted memories of being human. And when someone, namely Ranger, comes close, they turn and act on primal, angry instinct, attacking whatever comes close. And that's it. They're not conquering, they're not invading, they're just standing around. They're just still here in the aftermath. Imagine that. Imagine slowly losing yourself to the point of white-hot anger, rage to be taken out on anyone who isn't submerged in the same kind of rage, and now here you are, still walking around, twitching with festering hostility, probably wounded, probably aching from combat, and yet still you persist. Imagine how it must feel to simply stand around and wait for something to attack. In such a state, it must hurt to just exist. Now, let's take that concept and expand it outwards towards the creatures of the Quake dimensions, which in recent years have been named in lore as the Dreamlands. We have the Dimension of the Doomed, the Realm of Black Magic, the Netherworld, and the Elder World, 4 separate and unique realms all accessible from our tech bases on Earth. Each of the 4 dimensions of the Dreamlands contain mostly the same monsters within. There are 10 different eldritch creatures that we face in the Dreamlands, and of those 10, 2 of them are prominent mostly beginning in Episode 3, and 1 of them doesn't appear until Episode 4. That leaves 7 primary enemy types that we will be forced into combat with from start to finish. Considering the repetition of same creatures throughout 4 vastly different dimensions, and how vastly different these creatures are from one another, it's a fairly safe bet to say that none of them are indigenous to any of these realms that we visit. We'll talk about that idea more in just a moment, but consider their movement patterns and placement in the maps. Just like the Marines and the decimated military bases, all of the enemies in Quake are just kind of wandering around, waiting for someone or something to walk by and become a victim. But also like the Marines, these creatures aren't acting the way an invading force would. They're just kind of here. Now, there are times in gameplay where enemies will suddenly and surprisingly teleport into our path, but none of the monsters are shown to be able to teleport by their own powers, so someone or something must be doing that teleporting in order to halt our progression. By that logic, all the monsters, Marines, and creatures of different kinds are simply puppets without strings, all consumed by the influence of Quake, none of them able to do anything different. And, of course, they're all covered in blood, as though they've just finished carving up an outsider who didn't have the madness driving them, and are now hobbling back to position, waiting for their next victim or adversary, simply existing, simply attacking, and simply waiting to do it all over again. What a fucking terrifying concept. None of the enemies in Quake have any agency of their own. They're merely fraught with anger, with the need to attack, waiting for something to attack them so that they can do what they're supposed to do and then wait to do it again, painfully, achingly, waiting and then waiting some more. They're so fraught with a need for violence that it is comically easy to get enemies to fight each other. Over in Doom, enemy infighting is possible, sure, but the sheer volume of infighting that happens in Quake makes Doom's infighting look like calm discourse. And it doesn't take much for it to happen, because everything here in the Dreamlands is practically trembling with a need to fucking gut something. They just have no release. It is excruciating madness. In such a state, it must hurt to simply exist. Each of these enemies will appear in plentiful numbers, though not nearly as many as, say, Doom. Quake's new technology required more computing power than Doom did at that point in time, so the overwhelming opposition seen in Doom 2, for example, would no doubt have either fried motherboards or dropped the frame rate down into single digits. To that extent, with it being necessary for fewer enemies to appear on screen at any given time, id Software chose to make these enemies a hell of a lot tougher. Enemies refuse to just fucking die half the time, despite your insistence at pumping sometimes 4 to 6 rounds of double-barreled buckshot into them, or 3, sometimes 4 rockets. Explosive weapons, if you have the ammo for them, should be your go-to for stressful situations, as they'll clear rooms faster than anything else you have in your inventory, save for the lightning gun. But the lightning gun goes through ammo too quickly to rely on for anything other than a special occasion. Combat in Quake is best compared to erosion. You have to constantly wear down and outlast your enemies as you fire again and again and again and again, hoping against hope that you'll outlast them and halt their progress before they get close enough to kill you. Sometimes you'll hit them so hard you'll actually stop them in their tracks for a brief moment, or even knock them on their ass, but then they'll get right back to it and keep fucking coming at you. In the worlds of Quake, if something is moving, you keep shooting until it stops moving, even if it looks like it stopped moving. Then again, there are also zombies here, which absolutely will not die unless you hit them dead center with an explosive and ensure they've been completely jibbed, because otherwise they'll just lay down for a few moments and then get to their feet again. Imagine a world so full of anger that even the dead sit the fuck up in order to throw hands with you. The worst of these are the Shambler and the Fiend. The Shambler is a 10-foot tall, hairless bully with a mouth the size of a car, shooting Star Wars lightning bolts out of its chest. Your options are to either get close or find cover, and neither of those ever feels like a good idea. Back off too far, the lightning comes out. Get too close, and those huge claws come sweeping down to rip you limb from limb. Shamblers are deployed few and far between at first, until later episodes decide that 2, 3, sometimes 4 Shamblers in a map is actually a good way to spend the afternoon. They're resistant to explosions, maddeningly enough, but are weak against lightning, so there's your special occasion. Until the introduction of the lightning gun in episode 2, however, the Shambler dance is an act of intense desperation for survival. Fiends, meanwhile, are pink, snarling, parkour demons who can leap long distances in order to strip the meat from your bones. Their jumps are so fast and so difficult to gauge that I would rather fight a Shambler with no cover in sight than fight multiple fiends in a narrow hallway. Their attacks are merciless in close quarters, because without an open area to strafe jump out of reach, you might as well have your finger over the quick load button, as chances are that you'll be backed into a corner without realizing it. If that happens, odds are good, you're not getting out of that. Saying the worst of these enemies are the Shambler and the Fiend is a bit misleading, as I mean that these two are the worst of the common enemies. One creature only shows up in episode 4, the Elderworld, and this creature is the Spawn. A living, leaping glob of blue-black goo, the Spawn mercilessly hops around in erratic patterns, difficult to hit. One Spawn alone isn't the biggest issue, but multiple can and will usually mean the player bearing the brunt of multiple attacks at once, cremating your HP into nothing. The worst part is that when you do manage to kill one of these absolute bastards, they explode powerfully. The Spawn are primarily the reason why many gamers consider episode 4 of Quake to be the lesser of the 4 episodes, despite the chapter's genuinely intriguing map layouts. John Romero has been quoted as saying that the spawns were created late into development of Quake, and were so tough that they couldn't use them too much in map design. I'm not sure why the spawn would only appear in the Elder World, but I believe that's because Sandy Peterson created them. Sandy is responsible for almost all of the maps in Episode 4, save for the military base intro. Perhaps I could go and do a deeper dive into the development of Quake and discern truly how and when and where they were conjured, but instead, I think I'll simply lay the blame at the feet of Sandy and move forward from here. The corners that you can be backed into are potentially as deadly as the monsters surrounding. The military bases themselves are familiar enough, clearly designed by humans, but the environments of the 4 realms of the Dreamlands are questionable as to their origins. Just like the military environments, these spaces in the Dreamlands appear as though they had been populated at one point, but the only remaining residents are the victors of the slaughter. Perhaps the various creatures that we face were drawn from these 4 separate realms, and in places were used against each other. If Quake can teleport its minions directly in front of you, then surely it can teleport them to other dimensions. But what I find most interesting about the architecture of these spaces is not necessarily in how different they are, but in their similarities, specifically in how they're all designed to stop invaders in their tracks. Tricks and traps are the consistent theme throughout. Guillotines, crushers falling from the ceiling, lengthy descending elevator rides, and an overwhelming number of spike traps. Spikes, nails, rivets, whatever we're going to call them, are shot out from cannons placed along the walls, the floors, the ceilings, sometimes all 3 at once. And yet these traps are never triggered by the creatures ambling about the levels, only when Ranger approaches. Yes, this is a gaming design, so therefore it's meant specifically for the player, not the foes, but it is very interesting to think about from a potential lore perspective. Someone, at some point, built these incredible spaces and all of these deadly traps as a preventative measure, and they failed. Why did they fail? Maybe because these traps require a specific trigger, a living being. So then, if these enemies aren't activating the traps, are they then not alive as we know it? No consciousness, just vessels, shells, filled with madness and driven by the will of a very angry god? What a concept. That these monsters potentially aren't even alive, just animated by pure, ravenous anger and ache. I mean, look at this. Look at this god-awful pillar of destruction. If someone had built this to stop the encroaching madness and they failed, what the hell are we supposed to do in the face of that kind of force? But then again, that might be the point of it all. Doom employed satanic imagery and tropes for its enemies and environments, but Quake is a deeply Lovecraftian experience. H.P. Lovecraft was a writer who is credited with the concept of cosmic horror and the themes of madness therein, but he was impassibly racist. His writings, however, have been utilized and reworked by other less intolerant writers into truly excellent stories because those themes spark a certain kind of inescapable fear. Quake is one of those vehicles. I mean, the use of madness as an animating force simply by itself is about as Lovecraftian as it gets, but even further still are the environments and the atmosphere. Visually, the enemies fit the theme, with zombies, armless floating acid-vomiting oddities called scrags, the shamblers, which are actually part of Lovecraftian lore, and my personal favorite, the Vor. Fans have taken to referring to these enemies in recent times as Shalrath to avoid connection to a boring internet fetish, but no amount of ridiculous furry art will stop me from calling these things the Vor, because it's the perfect name and also fuck you. The Vor are the best enemy in the game, and possibly the only enemy directly related to the ultimate antagonist of Quake, who is revealed at the end of Episode 2 to be Shub-Niggurath, the Hell Mother, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. Shub-Niggurath is pulled directly from Lovecraft's stories, a perverse fertility deity, which then ties together the workings behind all of our enemies here. How a group of disparate creatures, all under the throes of madness, could work together somehow is a bit of a stretch, until we are informed that it is, in fact, the influence of Shub-Niggurath, and now, simply by extension of will, they are all her children. But consider the spindly legs and explosive orbs of the Vor, and the oscillating arms and teleportation orb of Shub-Niggurath. Aside from potentially the Scrags, the Vor are the only directly related monsters to the Hell Mother, and therefore, possibly, her actual factual children. But the Lovecraftian concepts continue further. Take, for example, the monster Cthon, the boss fight at the end of episode 1, the only other boss aside from Shub-Niggurath. He emerges from fire and throws fireballs at you, but cannot take damage the traditional way. Instead, Ranger is forced to run around the environment to lower a pair of conductors on either side of the boss, to then activate a massive stream of electricity between them, frying Cthon. Do this 3 times and the fight is over, but, as we'll see much later, the entity is not destroyed. Still, the point here is that you can't defeat the boss through standard issue marine gun blasting. Same rings true for Shub-Niggurath. After making our way around her pit of fire and death, defeating monsters she teleports in for protection, we come to a slipgate. But this slipgate is special. It's connected to a spiked orb that we've seen hovering around the arena since we arrived. The orb has a set path, and will eventually pass directly through Shub-Niggurath's body without harming her, continuing on its looping trail. Trial and error will help players deduce that the slipgate in front of us will teleport us directly to wherever the orb is on its path. So what we have to do is wait for the orb to pass through the Hellmother, jump through the slipgate, and let physics do the rest. 2 objects cannot exist in the same place at the same time. Thus, the cosmic deity is burst into small chunks, and we emerge victorious. I've seen a number of people complain about how unsatisfying the 2 boss fights in this game are, and mechanically speaking, this is true. There's no catharsis. But aesthetically and thematically, how else are you supposed to defeat an unknowable cosmic god? With guns? Not on your life, buddy. Lightning and telefragging actually make much more sense, even if you're denied the sweet release of big guns blasting. Which then answers the question of how we're supposed to stop the Hellmother if all of these traps in ancient cities could not keep her or her minions at bay. There isn't anything we can do. Certainly not with a big fucking gun. It takes something made by a god to defeat a god, which is what we do. And that's Quake. A series of enemy encounters where monsters lie in wait around every corner, sometimes teleporting in directly in front of you, all of them able to tank superfluous amounts of damage, all while you bob and weave, closing in to trigger a melee attack while immediately backing away to get out of range of said attack so you can attack some more, and maybe this next shot will kill that son of a bitch. Oh wait, no, it didn't. Maybe this next shot will. This shit is exhausting. I'm a veteran of this series and this game in particular, and even I was surprised playing through it again just how fundamentally tiring it is to play Quake. Numerous enemies, all of them twitching and waiting and aching to rip and tear, all of them decidedly more resilient than most enemies in most first-person shooters. If you haven't already caught on, there's a parallel that I've been working towards here, and that is how the experience of playing Quake is a close mirror to the experience of developing Quake. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you kids that id Software did that intentionally. I sincerely doubt it, but that feeling of strife, of going through the motions, of erosion and decay, of minions animated against their will, sitting and waiting for something to do, anything to do, well, it's hard not to imbue that kind of frustration and ache into the art you're making. Consider Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It is, by far, the darkest, meanest, and most action-packed of the Indiana Jones films. At the time of writing and filming, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were both going through individual divorces and dealing with the emotions that came packed along with that experience. They both felt raw, angry, in need of some release. They didn't intentionally channel that into Temple of Doom, but it ended up in the film regardless. id Software went through a harsh development cycle, the kind that breaks up studios. In this case, the kind that results in one of the founding members being fired. Tensions rose, tempers flared, Boundaries ripped away, frustrations abound. In such a state, it must hurt to simply exist. But it resulted in one of the most absorbing works of computer gaming art ever created, and, arguably, the most important first-person shooter of all time. Still, there is yet one aspect of Quake which I haven't directly commented on, and that's the impressively oppressive soundtrack by 9 Inch Nails. The reason for that is because the soundtrack had been more or less missing from the game for its first 25 years of existence. By confining the soundtrack to the CD-ROM, the music files did not play unless you had the CD in the drive. This presented a number of problems for future players. Primarily, as Steam and other digital delivery methods became the standard rather than the outlier, the need for CD-ROMs was removed, and therefore, the music files were relegated to lost media. Sure, the CDs themselves still existed, could still be purchased through various means, and could, in theory, still be inserted into a CD-ROM drive to listen to while playing the game, but one would need that physical media in order to do so. For years, then, as technology advanced sufficiently, playing Quake without the soundtrack became the unintentional standard. And, honestly, this isn't the worst thing. That's how I played Quake for 25 years. It speaks to the raw sound design of Trent Reznor that this game can be played without the background music and still be just as oppressive and laden with dread as it is with the soundtrack. But once you've played the game with the score worming its way through your ears and into your subconscious, you can't imagine playing it any other way. It's like the jelly to the peanut butter, which significantly elevates the audio experience, and the total experience as well. But legal bindings have to bind, and because of said bindings, the music remained caged to the CD for 25 years. Over time, gamers would create source ports for Quake which allowed new gamers to experience Quake on advanced operating systems, including the option to rip the music files from the CD and play them from a special folder. Sure, alright, but that means an extra step in the process, and setting up early source ports was already a daunting experience in and of itself. Not everyone, particularly casual gamers who were perhaps playing Quake for the first time, were necessarily up to the task of such workarounds just to hear music in the game. Maybe it was just daunting for me, a young father who knows hardly a lick about manipulating background folders or executable files. I just wanted to click install and play. But source ports would become easier to manage over time. GL Quake and Wind Quake gave way to Mark V, Dark Places, VK Quake, and Iron Whale. Iron Whale is my personal favorite of the bunch, and it's what I used for the footage of this video. But still, the music was missing. Until at long last in 2021, a plucky little studio called Night Dive was tasked with remastering Quake for modern audiences for the game's 25th anniversary, and in doing so, performed the impossible. They got the music back. The build-up to QuakeCon 2021 was a phenomenal time to be a Quake fan. Those of us who were watching with anticipation were frothing at the mouth with news of what we hoped would be a brand new entry in the Quake series. At this point in time, the Wolfenstein reboot had gotten 2 games in its series, and the Doom reboot also had 2 entries. So, by that logic, with Quake Champions having released 4 years prior and still not yet out of early access, and the monument of the original's 25th birthday, it seemed like a slam dunk to hear word of a brand new game. Instead, what we got was Quake Remastered, built from the ground up by Night Dive using their Kex engine, looking and sounding better than ever. New, enhanced character and weapon models, higher res textures, dynamic lighting, smoother animations. Night Dive went above and beyond to ensure that Quake, stepping out of the shadows and onto the larger cross-platform stage, would be able to stand tall beside the new generation of first-person shooters, dubbed boomer shooters, such as Dusk and Ultrakill. And, in a modern miracle of legalities and royalties, the remaster came with the ability to play the original soundtrack in-game once more, no CD required. Perhaps Trent Reznor had been feeling nostalgic, or perhaps it seemed the perfect time for the score to finally be mutually beneficial for all parties involved. In any case, Quake's soundtrack appeared on Spotify for the first time as an official release by 9 Inch Nails, and the score was made available to purchase on vinyl as well. In many ways, this fact alone felt like a hard-won battle for fans of Quake who couldn't be happier. And yet, at first, I was disappointed. Okay, sure, I told myself, a remaster. A remaster with prettier graphics. I suppose that's fine and all, but I'm goddamn tired of pretending to like Quake Champions. Where's the new game? Well, much to my surprise and delight, the remaster opened the door for new gamers in ways that, at the time, could not have been fully appreciated. To start with, let's talk about that soundtrack. In Quake, fans of Nine Inch Nails can hear the influence of Trent's work prior to this soundtrack. Broken and the Downward Spiral, as well as some guitar work that hints at where he would find himself next with The Fragile. Quake's ambient score is, at turns, discordant and throbbing, and at others, muffled in a way as though one is listening to it underwater. In one track, schizophrenic whispers assault the ears, making use of multi-channel technology to ricochet back and forth from ear to ear, strung together by a low hum that draws comparisons to an electric generator. Non-traditional instruments create sounds that penetrate and pulse in rhythmic heartbeat patterns, escalating at times almost as if to represent encroaching madness. Trent Reznor, in spite of his usual sonic persona, crafted a soundtrack that represents the antithesis to the Doom Eternal Argent Metal score utilized by modern shooters. If anything, Quake's soundtrack hews much closer to survival horror games, and would be just as much at home in the background of Call of Cthulhu as it is here. Only the Quake theme, with its scathing guitars and high-pitched screams in the background, conjure anything that newcomers would expect to hear. The music throughout acts like a highlighter pen, amplifying the themes of madness to an almost unbearable pitch. Quake just isn't Quake without Nine Inch Nails, and so to have this long-lost piece of the pie returned is a horrific delight. Night Dive did more than just get Trent's blessing and a fresh coat of paint over the visuals, though. For starters, the remaster came packaged with multiplayer components so gamers could deathmatch like it was 1996 all over again, using a decentralized server model, meaning players hosted their own matches through a proxy. On top of that, the remaster also provided compatibility with a number of player-made mods and expansions for Quake. Sweetening the pot even further was a new official expansion for Quake developed by Machine Games called Dimension of the Machine. As mentioned earlier in the video, this was Machine Games' second expansion for Quake. The first was titled Dimension of the Past, released in 2016 to coincide with the game's 20th anniversary. And all of this for just $10 USD. Unless, of course, you already owned the game through Steam, in which case the remaster was added to your library for absolutely free, as is described on the Steam page. Enjoy the original authentic version of Quake, now with up to 4K and widescreen resolution support, enhanced models, dynamic and colored lighting, anti-aliasing, depth of field, the original atmospheric soundtrack and theme song by Trent Reznor, and more. There's never been a better time to play Quake. And I have to agree with that. But is the remaster the best way to play Quake? Keep in mind, I'm not looking to knock the remaster in any way, because the very existence of the remaster has been a boon to the renaissance of Quake in the last 5 years, as well as the soundtrack rightfully returning for gameplay experience. But does that mean the remaster is the best way to play the game today? Taking multiple factors into consideration, there are a few minor hiccups which prevent the port from being the definitive experience. Firstly, are the graphical settings. Now, this is easily overcome if one wants to revert everything from modern-day dynamic, anti-aliased, overclocked shadows back down to the crunchy textures and baked lighting of the original. 1 or 2 clicks in the menu settings and voila, instantaneous retro presentation. But for the modernist, dialings to be default settings does little for game preservationists such as myself, who want to see older games revived on modern technology, held up for future gamers, while maintaining the experience as it was 20, 30, or even 40 years ago. Yes, I understand that the modernist presentation helps the game present more attractive to new gamers, therefore helping sales, therefore helping the game's shelf life overall. But consider how Halo's Master Chief Collection had a setting where the game's visuals could be flipped from modern execution to original recipe at the press of a button anytime during gameplay. Same thing with the recent remaster of the original Tomb Raider games. Here, while we're given the options in the menu to select or deselect what we prefer for the aesthetics, it feels a little like work to whittle away at the modernism in order to have the nostalgia of the visuals we remember. Even the game's default font is set to a clean, white sans serif, requiring the effort of digging through the settings to return to the original crunchy typeface. Accessibility settings in video games is oddly a debate amongst some, which I think is silly and joyless. I fully believe that games should have accessibility settings for those whose experience will be enhanced with cleaner typeface, or colorblind settings, or audio settings. But I question whether those settings need to be activated by default. When it's difficult to recognize the original game upon loading, that feels like a problem. Second is the matter of model interpolation. For those who aren't familiar with the term, interpolation, as described on Wikipedia, is the automatic generation of in-between frames between two keyframes to create smooth, fluid motion in animation. One of Quake's more iconic aspects of its visual aesthetic is the lack of interpolation. Enemies and weapons and environmental effects move with a jerky, stuttery, stop-motion effect. The remaster, like some source ports, offers the choice of implementing model interpolation, smoothing out animations across the board, and the effect is turned on by default. With this effect, gone are the unsettling and difficult to discern movements of Quake's various creatures. Sure, they're still scary from an aesthetic design sense, but the way they move is no longer unsettling. Quake's Lovecraftian elements depend on the element of the unnatural, of unknowable or irrational. Erratic movement on the part of enemies in Quake is a crucial element of that sensation. But this, too, is a setting that can be turned on or off in the game's menu. Want those eldritch abominations doing the herky-jerky two-step again? Not a problem. Switch off the interpolation, and we're back in business. It's simply the question of why this is turned on by default. Preservationists, again, are no doubt ripping their hair out at these observations, confounded by modern science and technology and the agency of the player to adapt the game and its visuals to their own standards. Modern players, no doubt, are likely scratching their heads, wondering what the big deal is about. The game is pretty, and pretty graphics are kinda neat. To which I say, fair. Perhaps I'm an old man yelling at clouds. Pretty imagery shouldn't be gate-kept. Old heads such as myself can turn off all the bells and whistles and sit in our dour little corners, shaking our heads and fists and lamenting the rise of brand new doohickeys and specialty hardware that those Gen Alpha kids are raised on. Why, back in my day, we had to run games in software mode on low settings just to get them to hit 20 frames per second. Enhanced models and sans serif in Quake? Not on my watch. But again, all of this, the high-fidelity graphics, the new models, the movement, the lighting, all of it is in service of a love letter to Quake. Night Dive went through the entirety of the game and polished it up with the gentility and grace of Bob Ross. And those settings can be turned off or on at the touch of a button in order to return the game to its original settings. So, in all fairness, I am, no doubt, splitting hairs. I'm stuck in the mud, raising pitchforks where there are no monsters, for they are all in my head and can be adjusted in menu. There was, however, one small thing that I noticed while playing the remaster for this video, the tiniest of differences that in its own way acts as the remaster's biggest butterfly effect, and that was the control scheme. When Quake was first released, the concept of WASD keyboard and mouse as a control scheme was far from default. Mouse-keyboard combinations were not a new thing with Quake, as it had already had means for such controls as far back as Wolfenstein 3D, but it wasn't until professional deathmatch gamer Thresh popularized playing Quake using WASD for movement and mouse for turning that the control scheme began to catch on, and eventually became default. Strafing, then, at the time the game was created, was an oddity. A useful oddity, to be sure, but an oddity nonetheless. With Quake, the programmed movement for strafing was not smooth as we understand it in gaming today. Quake's strafe movements are, instead, slightly faster than forward or backwards movement, like a quick step into a speed walk. Pressing A and D in rapid succession creates the sensation of a running back juking left and right in order to avoid a member of the opposing football team, which in turn lends a sense of anxiety to combat. Movement then becomes frantic, ducking back and forth, running, fighting just a little bit against the controls themselves, which unintentionally lends itself thematically to the game. After all, with the rest of the enemies in the game having already succumbed to madness, fighting against that frantic moveset in a way has the player themselves battling their own hurriedness to stay focused and keep their line of fire tight. But the remaster cleans up the control scheme. Every movement, forward, backward, side to side, are all the same movement speed now. And why not? That's the bog standard in first-person shooters today, so therefore, that's what players know. The difference is subtle, yet makes all the difference when comparing. By having smoother, better control over the character, players have fuller agency within Quake. Therefore, more power fantasy is achieved. But slightly faster movement side to side forces the player to recalculate everything on the fly. It simulates desperation within a moveset that we gamers take for granted. Quake Remastered is not unkind to the source material. Far from it. Quake Remastered is Night Dive's love letter to Quake, something that became that much more evident with the remaster of Quake 2. But it has been unintentionally sanitized. The teeth of Quake are not as sharp in the remaster as they are in the original, or as can be found in playing through the source ports. Sure, turn off the aesthetic differentials and play with the crunchiest graphics and enjoy the fantastic score in order to complete the mood. But the control scheme is missing that harsh desperation that the original holds. Is it the end of the world? Hardly. But does it make it so new players don't get quite the same experience? Absolutely. So then, with that, what is the best way to play Quake today? A good question. Purchasing the remaster provides access to the original game files, so regardless of how one wants to dive in, there's no additional purchases to be made. Win number one. And if someone new to the franchise buys the remaster and plays the remaster and enjoys the remaster enough to want to play more, then that, without a doubt, is win number two. But let's say you, like me, having strode through this entire process, are now wondering how to proceed with future gameplay. A simple source port won't have the music embedded into the experience, but the remaster won't have the frantic control scheme that lends to the atmosphere. So, how to proceed playing through the expansions? After playing through Quake using the Iron Whale source port and immediately again using the remaster, I decided to take advantage of an aspect of Iron Whale and therefore split the difference. Iron Whale has an option where you can play through the original game files or the remastered game files, and what a difference it makes. You have access to all the same bells and whistles that the remaster provides, such as the enhanced character models, which I happen to adore, but you also play the game using Quake's original control scheme, the upgrades, and the soundtrack of the remaster with the frantic movement of the original. What a combo. For my own personal taste, I decided to go through all the settings and fine-tune the aesthetics to my liking. Enhanced models? Yes, please and thank you. They pleased me to no end. Dynamic lighting? You know what? Why not? It's especially fun to see the deep reds and blues of the power-ups flashing about and the blossom of illumination from each rocket explosion. Model interpolation stays off, and environmental graphics stay as crunchy as they can. All the best efforts of id Software and Night Dive Studios all wrapped up in one package. And the best part, if you have Steam open, Iron Whale connects to Steam stats so that you can get your Chivos and track your gameplay time, even though you're running it through the source port. Whether or not other source ports have this functionality, I'm unaware. I didn't test any other source ports for this function. I just happened to have Iron Whale for its compatibility with Quake Brutalist Jam 3, and so when the program prompted me to pick whether I wanted to play the original or remaster, it was news to me. I'm sure someone in the comments will enlighten us as to whether Quake Spasm or Mark V or Dark Places can do the same. And if anyone on an individual level has a better experience with a different source port or strictly the remaster itself, I'm glad for it. So here I am. Quake is 30. And that's weird. But not as weird as the thought that I've never played any of the game's expansions. Before you flood the comments, let me respond by saying, yes, I know. For some reason that I've never been able to clearly define, I'm not a fan of expansions or mods to games that I love if they weren't made by the original developers. Give me the vanilla experience, god damn it, and nothing else. This, for me, means that I've missed out on 4 expansions. 30 years worth of content. Some really good shit, too, that I've heard rave reviews over. But Quake is sacred. It's a near and dear thing to my heart. I have tattoos of Quake, for God's sake. Why would I want to play anything that could dilute that experience? Well, recently I've started to come to my senses and learn the error of my ways. New content not made by the original developers can be fun, and not only that, but provide new and different perspectives on something that I've been looking at only one way for the past 30 years. In the midst of working on this video, I realized that there are 2 other versions of Quake that I have also never played. The first is the N64 port of Quake, and the other is the often unrecognized Sega Saturn port of Quake. Both of these console ports have deeply fascinating tidbits and contributions to the history of video gaming as a whole, so to simply ignore them while working on such a massive celebration of Quake felt as though I would be committing a cardinal sin. So with that mindset, I sat down, I calibrated my settings in both source ports and emulators, and I settled in to celebrate 30 years on my own terms. And what a celebration it turned out to be. Inevitably, fans of the Quake series will turn their lamentations to the notion that there has not yet been a direct sequel to Quake 1, as subsequent games in the franchise bob and weave in wildly different directions, both thematically and narratively. Having now played the original expansions to Quake 1, my response to those lamentations is, go play the fucking expansions. What a goddamn surprise and delight they turned out to be. Quake's first 2 expansions, Scourge of Armagon and Dissolution of Eternity, are so good and so engaging and so delightfully build off of Quake's premise that it's hard not to now consider that the original Quake trilogy was the base game and its 2 expansions. The first of these, Scourge of Armagon, was developed by Hypnotic Software and released on March 5th, 1997. Originally titled The Rift, the expansion began development in September of 1996 and wrapped within 6 months. 6 months. A dream for id Software, unrealized. This frantic pace would explain the decompressed chaoticism of the expansion's gameplay, of which there is something intriguingly unhinged. The best possible description that I can offer up after having played it is that Scourge of Armagon is the direct-to-video B-movie sequel to Quake, simultaneously bound to the world of the game and yet unshackled from its intense mood of madness. Where Quake is submerged deep within Lovecraftian cosmic horror, Scourge of Armagon swerves into the territory of gothic horror, sinister and moody, more in line with the works of Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and Edgar Allan Poe. Yet, it is all wrapped up in the packaging of a lurid, video-nasty VHS tape, bearing a cover with a grinning skull and eyeballs and just enough skin remaining to elicit a giggle. This expansion is as close as we'll ever get to Puppet Combo making a Quake game. Taking place immediately after the defeat of Shub-Niggurath, Scourge of Armagon opens up with Ranger discovering a lone slipgate out of her hellish nest, emerging into an eerily quiet military base. It turns out that the forces of Quake continue to animate themselves even after the defeat of the Hell Mother, and that the base Ranger has found himself in has been evacuated after being infiltrated by said forces. Beyond this realm lies a being known as Armagon, Quake's general, who remains quite determined to see victory for Quake's campaign. Ranger's job, then, is to carve his way through dimensions on a path directly to Armagon's realm, stop the general, and end the invasion for good. I would like to take a brief moment to talk about Hypnotic Software, the developers of this expansion, because they only made one game under the studio name Hypnotic. Connoisseurs of retro shooter history will know the team better by the name they settled on after this project, Ritual Entertainment. Ritual would go on to develop 1998's Sin, 2000's Heavy Metal Fact 2 and Blair Witch Volume 3, the Ellie Kedward tale, 2003's Elite Force 2, 2006's Sin Episodes, and the cancelled expansion to 2005's Quake 4, titled Quake 4 Awakening. As they were known in 1997, Hypnotic Software was comprised of multiple names formerly of 3D realms, such as Richard Level Lord Gray, Jim Dosey, Robert Atkins, and Tom Mustaine. It feels like it. Scourge of Armagon has the deft bob and weave acceleration of Duke Nukem 3D mixed with the intense visuals of Quake, creating something less inclined to either, but possibly more towards Doom. Scourge of Armagon throws enemies at the player as though the concept is going out of style, unwilling to pause for longer than a few breaths between traps and ambushes. If you've played Quake and thought the game might be better if you could fight 5 shamblers in a row while dodging lightning bolts from a deadly power generator, then by golly do I have a game for you. All of the tension, the ache, the anger that swam about the atmosphere of Quake has been replaced by the sinister sensation of being trapped in a Halloween haunted house. Around every corner is something just waiting to pop out at you, no longer angry, but giddy with opportunity. And there's such a thrill to this haunted house scenario. Sure, the whole thing is tense, and the jump scares will absolutely scare you the fuck out of your wits, but afterwards comes the sense of relief, laughter, and the slowly lowering levels of adrenaline. We go through haunted houses for the same reasons that we watch scary movies. That's the spirit of Scourge of Armagon. The expansion is much more linear than the base game, where Quake provided the opportunity to choose which of the 4 episodes on offer to play through next. Scourge of Armagon opens with a difficulty selection hub, a slipgate to walk through, and we're off to the races. There are 3 distinct episodes to the game, but rather than select which one you want to play, it's a start-to-finish endeavor. Once you're in, you're in. Episode 1, Fortress of the Dead, takes the familiar formula and flips it. Instead of one military base at the start of each episode, Scourge of Armagon has one large base split into multiple maps. With episode 1, we're going to get all of those maps out of the way before discovering the slipgate, which will lead us closer to Armagon and on to episode 2. I actually really like this setup. An entire episode devoted to Ranger crawling through a dilapidated base, fighting former colleagues, and discovering new weapons truly lends to the sense of upwards momentum that Scourge of Armagon has to offer. There's also a new enemy on display, the Centroid, which is a mechanical scorpion drone with nail guns for pincers. Fantastic! The new weapons, meanwhile, are the proximity launcher, a grenade launcher variant with sticky bombs that explode either on impact or when someone gets too near, and the laser cannon, which utilizes the cells for the lightning gun and rapid fires laser beams that ricochet off walls if they don't hit their target. Both are great. The proximity launcher didn't get quite as much usage out of me as the laser cannon did, but it's a lot of fun to set traps when you know something is lurking around a corner. Using the episode to explore one large base provides a sense of continuity that Quake sacrificed in favor of inclement dread. The military bases in Quake are all fine maps, slices of what resembles sanity in that game before being thrust into the unknown void of the remainder of each episode. But I never got a sense of place with those maps. Were each of those bases located in the same base on Earth? Were they all 4 separate bases, kept separate on purpose? I don't know. I doubt we'll ever know unless someone asks John Romero and he provides a definitive answer. But Fortress of the Dead is a singular place, a fascinating exercise in continuity that asks more than a few questions about what the military was actually doing in their quest to stop Quake. The pumping station, the storage facility, the lost mine, the research facility, and the secret map military complex leave an unsavory taste in the mouth when we stop to think about them. Why did the military have a mine here? What were they digging for? Who thought it would be a good idea to cage a pair of shamblers on Earth for study? Even more important, how are the minions of Shub-Niggurath seeping through to our realm? We don't get any answers because this isn't that kind of story, but the implications arising from those questions are enough to bleed in a little bit of that Lovecraftian element from the base game. And you know what, kids? I do love me a little bit of connective tissue. At the end of Fortress of the Dead, Hypnotic decides to show off just a little bit by having the player step through the final slipgate to dive into Armagon's realm, with an excellent transition where Ranger soars through an unholy void and a pentagram formed by bolts of lightning. He lands at one of those dreadful archways we've seen so many times in Quake, this time flanked by 2 power generators. This is such a treat and such a goddamn flex that I can't help but smile enviously at it. The ending text informs us that this passageway is how the followers of Quake have been able to get through to our realm, overloading one of the military's own slipgates. Now we have to find the portal's power source on the other side, shut it down, and stop the invasion force from surging through. Episode 2, Dominion of Darkness, immediately strikes us with the gothic horror overtones that will be present in the rest of the game. The aesthetic here is one of castles, cathedrals, catacombs, and crypts, and boy, oh boy, did I love it. Aesthetically, that is. From a design perspective, Dominion of Darkness at once impresses and frustrates. Fortress of the Dead had intimated that we were going to be blessed with ambushes and monster closets galore in this expansion, and it wasn't kidding. There are multiple points throughout Dominion of Darkness where it felt like Hypnotic said, "Hey, you're a rough and tough gamer lad, aren't you, boy? Here's a fuckload of grimy ghouls to conquer and prove it." The more intense pacing of the levels might certainly be a little welcome, but it doesn't always translate well to fun gameplay. Hypnotic, with their prior experience in Duke Nukem 3D, understands how to place enemies on a chessboard and deploy them in such sweaty manners as to make a first-person shooter feel like you're performing CrossFit. But I don't think that Hypnotic truly understood just how resilient the monsters of Quake truly are. Because running down a flight of stairs and around a blind corner into a shambler and a vor simultaneously is not just terrifying, it is nearly an instant quick load, because the odds of player death within moments of that meeting are pretty fucking high. Dominion of Darkness features numerous narrow corridors and close quarters environments requiring quick twitching bunny hop parkour for survival, all while keeping one eye out for more monsters and closets and blind corner adversaries. The proximity launcher and the laser cannon might be welcome additions to the arsenal, but there isn't enough firepower on hand at any given time to justify the higher number of monsters at any given point. Hypnotic grants us a final new weapon here in these halls, however, but despite how fascinating it is from an aesthetic perspective, it falls flat as a weapon. Mjolnir is the mystical hammer of Thor, which both in myth and here in game launches bolts of lightning when slammed on the ground. Now, that sounds like a lot of fun, but you'll need cells for the lightning to work. Otherwise, it's just a hammer. A hammer more powerful than the standard issue axe that Ranger carries, mind you, but a hammer nonetheless. And considering that those cells are better put to use with either the laser cannon or the lightning gun, Mjolnir ended up being a quirky, awkward weapon that I never felt like I understood how to wield it. So I didn't. There's also another new enemy here to watch out for, the Gremlin. These little butt heads are easy to underestimate with how squishy they are, barely standing up to 2 rounds from the double barrel, but their trickiness comes in being shitty little thieves. If a gremlin gets too close to the player, they can steal whatever weapon the player is currently holding, and even wield it poorly. But what really makes gremlins so nasty is that they can resurrect dead enemies, even more nasty in the method. They appear to eat fallen monsters and then, I assume, vomit them up whole. But what isn't nasty is the other new enemy, the Spike Mine. Calling it an enemy is a disservice, as it really is just a mindless homing missile whose explosion is far too powerful for this kind of experience. Spike mines love to hide in high corners or in shadows so that you'll pass by unawares until the only thing you hear is the explosion and then the camera has fallen over. These shitty little nuisances probably fit the Quake theme, but are so annoyingly frustrating that it doesn't matter. They just piss me off. Hypnotic tries to level the playing field here slightly, in the form of a couple of power-ups. We have the Empathy Shield and the Horn of Conjuring. Both suck. The Empathy Shield is the most useful of the two. It provides a minimal amount of protection against enemy attacks, but the fun part is that it returns a portion of damage done by enemies back to the enemies. So if they hit you, they're also hitting themselves. Fun in concept, weak in execution. Mostly because being engaged by enemies means you're facing far too much firepower for any one ranger to handle all at once, so you're not going to want to stand still enough for the shield to have any effect. If it cut down damage further than it does, I would probably have a different song to sing about it. Also, 2, the Horn of Conjuring, which when picked up, summons a friendly eldritch monster to run side by side with Ranger and attack foes. Again, on paper, an interesting idea. In practice, the summoned monster walks around slowly, following Ranger at a lazy pace, getting stuck on walls, chairs, corners, and hardly ever being useful. One time, the Horn summoned 2 Rottweilers, which were instantly killed by a fiend. It was just kind of sad to watch. I did get to summon a Shambler one time, which was fairly cool, but the lack of pathfinding made it so that it was fairly useless. What kept me going through Dominion of Darkness were the aesthetics of the episode, which were just phenomenal. Scourge of Armagon's direct-to-video sequel vibes are most emphasized here in this episode, where it's clear that the goings-on are wearing the skin of Quake, but acting on an entirely different set of principles. Sinister, gothic horror. And the environments are exquisite. The Black Cathedral is a map that, functioning entirely on its own, is an easy success. Stained glass windows, an image of Christ that actually fits the environment, a chapel bell ringing to impart oncoming horror, and a trick floor where you have to carefully feel your way across as portions drop into the lava below. Yes, there are boatloads of monsters to mash, but the sprawling, intricately designed cathedral itself is so well crafted that I have been thinking about it for days. Then again, I've also been thinking about the final act of Dominion of Darkness, Mortem's Keep, and how the climax pits Ranger against 3 Shamblers, 2 Ogres, and a power generator that launches bolts of lightning in your path the moment you emerge into the arena where it's being kept. Despite the mega health pickup located directly in front of you, this is a daunting task. Actually, let me rephrase that. This is bullshit. Upon slowly grinding your way through all of these foes and destroying the generator, 2 more Shamblers appear, and while those are optional and you could just leap through the exit portal immediately, this too is bullshit. And what a shame that is, because Mortem's Keep is pristine, dank, horrific, gothic, environmental bliss that I wanted to turn around and immediately replay. Except I didn't, because his absolutely silly fight at the end is a waste of my time. It could be said that the removal of Shub-Niggurath's maddening influence has awakened something in the creatures once puppeteered by her. Where once there was ache, anxiousness, anxiety, only relieved by turning violently on whatever crossed their path, these creations have been unshackled and unleashed to complete bedlam. I recently watched the film Weapons, the climax of which deals with a phalanx of children chasing down a witch after being released from a catatonic spell, and when they catch her, they violently tear her body apart, limb from bloody limb. I thought of Scourge of Armagon while watching that impressive sequence, because much the same is happening here. All of that lurking madness and hurt have been given free rein, held back no longer, and the results are exactly what you think. After destroying the generator powering Armagon's portal, it's time to tackle the General himself. This leads directly into Episode 3, The Rift. We're informed via chapter text that Ranger has landed on the shores of reality, but in a time and place unknown to him. Where Fortress of the Dead was comprised of military tech bases and Dominion of Darkness gothic environments, The Rift blends the two aesthetics seamlessly and effortlessly. This, as we'll see at the end, is in service of the overall vision, and while the enemy placement here might be even more bullshit than in Episode 2, my god does it all look truly amazing. The scenery is less gothic in favor of dark fantasy, as though a wizard had intentions to become the modern Prometheus, and it is all stunning. Absolutely stunning work here throughout. Metal and stone, stained glass and electricity. Hypnotic has conjured some powerful visuals to complete this journey towards the end, so much so that it pains me that I can't truly get behind the overall design and enemy placement. I wonder, while rewatching this footage, if Hypnotic just wanted to make something more straightforward in the shooter genre, something like Doom or Duke Nukem. Elements of Quake are here. The dark tone, the slipgates, the visual feel alone suggests a variant on the same themes as the base game. But gameplay-wise, Scourge of Armagon is so vastly different, sometimes in thrilling ways, other times in frustrating disappointment. The Rift clearly has ideas and a vision. Describing this as a blend of the two aesthetic values we've marched through already isn't simply lip service. Every single enemy in the game is present and accounted for here. Grunts, Enforcers, Centroids, Fiends, Shamblers, Vor, even the goddamn spawns make an appearance. Moment-to-moment gameplay in Scourge of Armagon may not be exactly what I want from a Quake entry, but it never quite crosses the threshold into gimmick or insurmountable frustration, due in part to the fucking aura farming every single map is serving. Environments in the Rift are, at least, more open than they were in Dominion of Darkness, allowing just enough breathing room for the gameplay to work better than it had before. The maps themselves, Tur Torment, Pandemonium, Limbo, the Gauntlet, Armagon's Lair, and the secret Edge of Oblivion, capture the fleeting edge of Lovecraftian vision and put it to good work. Perhaps the connecting thread was for us, the player, to feel a sense of constraint in Dominion of Darkness, caught in a mire we needed to slice through with effort in order to cut fucking loose with the Rift. Sure, there's still plenty of bullshit to witness. 4 Vor on the top of a tower? No fucking thank you. But the ride takes a steady downward slope, escalating frantically, culminating in the penultimate and absolutely cathartic map, the Gauntlet. It's just mayhem, pure chaos. Trap rooms and meat grinders and a whole lot of enemies to jib. Hypnotic wisely gifts the player a bevy of ammunition and weapons at the top of the map, signaling that this is going to get a little hectic before plunging them into the midst of the fray. I had so much fun with the Gauntlet. It was, at last, a moment to fully cut loose and use up all the ammo I had on hand, because the promise of turning a corner, finding more ammo, and then once again emptying that replenishment was ever present throughout. At long last, I was the walking calamity, not my enemies. Armagon himself, the final boss, is arguably a better boss fight than either Cathan or Shub-Niggurath, but not by much. We at least get to fight the son of a bitch face to face rather than enact some environmental shenanigans. Visually, Armagon appears to be a precursor to Quake 2's Strogg, a cybernetic eldritch horror thematically bringing together the technological and the gothic horrors of the entire expansion into one singular opponent. He's also a bit of a pushover if you pop in and out of cover. It doesn't take much in the way of ammunition for the general to explode into meat sauce, leaving only his metal legs behind, although I did get caught by surprise by his wildly potent homing rocket attacks on my first attempt. Like I said, arguably a better boss fight, one with a great entrance, but the devil is in the details. Still, it brings me quite a bit of joy to see something that even Quake didn't give us, an ending cutscene. Watching Ranger wait for the portal to close and then sprint through the arena to pop through a newly exposed slipgate to return home put a smile on my face that I didn't know I was waiting for. Small touches like these can elevate even mediocre content into something grand. Scourge of Armagon understands when to play exactly the right cards, even if the rest of the deck isn't as satisfying as it could be. Hence, the direct-to-video comparisons. This may not be exactly what I wanted it to be, but it was damn near close. It was more Quake in a different light, once again refuting the idea that the concept of Quake can contain multitudes. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. A few too many instances of bullshit monster closets and ambushes kept me at bay, and more than a few times I locked in so tight that I couldn't actively remember the maps themselves afterwards. Going back through my footage reminded me, oh, yeah, that's right, that's what that section looked like. Many times throughout this experience, I couldn't actually enjoy the design for what it was, simply because too much was being thrown at me. Ultimately, Scourge of Armagon takes Quake into a parallel line of thinking, a different perspective on the horror it dealt with in the base campaign, and I appreciated that. Reveling within the gothic horror and dark fantasy that I chose to lean into, albeit slightly flawed, this expansion proves worthy enough to be considered the sequel to Quake. Sewing all of this together is the excellent soundtrack by composer Ji-Hoon Hwang, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. Ji-Hoon's work as a computer game composer is much more prolific than I first realized. You ever hear the phrase, your favorite rapper's favorite rapper? Ji-Hoon is your favorite game composer's game composer. With soundtrack credits on games such as MechWarrior 2, Heavy Gear, Dark Reign, Battlezone, Uprising, Vigilante 8, and Apocalypse, Ji-hoon composed the soundtrack not just for Scourge of Armagon, but also Dissolution of Eternity, which lends a unifying undercurrent to the two disparate expansion packs. Ji-hoon's work here is informed by Trent Reznor's somber soundscape, borrowing the crunchy guitars for a few tracks, but adds a romantic orchestral background. Synth, strings, and piano weave in and out of fast-paced guitar chords and drums, at times presenting a cinematic horror soundscape, while other times leaning into the Bobby Prince Doom vibes for action deathmatch adrenaline. Both soundtracks complement each other, stringing together one expansive narrative. As we'll soon see, Dissolution of Eternity takes place literally moments after the ending of Scourge of Armagon, so the choice to have Ji-hoon craft the score for both maintains a kind of coherency that smacks of back-to-back film sequels, like Back to the Future Parts 2 and 3, or Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions. Honestly, I love the soundtrack's vibes. Ji-hoon understood the assignment. The soundtrack is overly dramatic, slotting excellently within the B-movie VHS vibes. Never once did I think, "Aw man, where's the 9-inch nails?" Trent's work was exactly what the base game required, and would not have worked here. Ji-hoon's work would have diminished the vibe of the base game, but is the perfect companion for the expansions. And as much as I love the original score, Trent has copyrighted that soundtrack to hell and back, so I can't play it for you here. Which is fine. Trent Reznor is my favorite musician of all time, and I believe he deserves his pennies. However, I can play some of Ji-hoon's score for you right now, so sit back a moment and enjoy the selections. Scourge of Armagon's ending text informs us that, once again, we've saved the day, that Armagon's fortress has collapsed after losing its magic, and the rift created to send Armagon's troops through time has sealed forever. But is this the last we'll see of Quake's minions? Only time will tell. Time did, in fact, tell, and it told loudly. It turned the volume up to 11, cranked up all of the equalizers, and said, "Baby, you ain't seen nothing yet." Where Scourge of Armagon perfectly captures the direct-to-video horror vibes, Dissolution of Eternity exemplifies the direct-to-DVD weird sequel that kinda slaps but everyone dismisses because you can only find copies of it at the gas station in a simple cardboard slip on the spinner rack. And it is so much fun. But first, of course, a little background. Dissolution of Eternity was developed by Rogue Entertainment and was released on March 19th, 1997, only 2 weeks after Scourge of Armagon. The proximity of the two releases helps solidify the back-to-back sequel atmosphere and was no doubt intentional. Rogue Entertainment, at this point in time, was hot off the release of their first game, Strife, an experimental first-person shooter made in conjunction with id Software. Rogue would go on after this to develop 1998's Quake 2 expansion, Ground Zero, as well as 2000's American McGee's Alice. After this, the team would begin work on Counter-Strike Condition Zero for Valve, work which ended when Jim Molinitz, head of Rogue, would surprise everyone by leaving the studio. Valve felt betrayed by this action, and chose to put Condition Zero in the hands of Gearbox instead. Oddly enough, as far as side notes go, Condition Zero would also leave the hands of Gearbox, and would then be given to Ritual Entertainment to work on the game. Even odder, Ritual's work on Condition Zero would not satisfy Valve either, so the project ultimately was completed by Turtle Rock Studios. Rogue Entertainment shut down not too long after this disappointment. And yet, as many resilient developers are wont to do, many of Rogue's devs reformed into a brand new studio, Nerve Software, and their first project would be 2005's Doom 3 expansion, Resurrection of Evil. Since then, Nerve has worked on multiple games and successful ports of classic titles such as Doom 1 and 2 and the Duke Nukem 3D 20th Anniversary Edition, which we will not hold against them. Back to Dissolution of Eternity. The vibes are wholly immaculate here. Visceral, fantastical, pulpy goodness. Fuck it. Dissolution of Eternity is Quake 3 Tokyo Drift. Rogue understood that they could not emulate what id performed with Quake's base campaign, so instead, they ripped off the tires, put on a new set, and drove it like they stole it. Completely divorced from any notion of impactful horror, Dissolution of Eternity gear shifts from Lovecraftian to James Cameron, providing an action horror spectacle not unlike Aliens, complete with a plot that revolves entirely around time travel. Go big or go the fuck home is the word of the day, and the expansion never stops moving long enough for the player to either catch their breath or question what the hell is actually going on here. Fortunately, they don't need to. The manual setup for the story cuts directly to the chase. Emerging from a slipgate into a human military base after defeating Armagon, Ranger senses something is awry. On the ground is a fallen Marine, beside whom is an open, leather-bound book with religious text preaching the glory of Master Quake, dated some thousands of years before. Ranger exclaims, "God friggin' damn! This can't be happening!" and then immediately picks up a shotgun and scrambles into the nearest slipgate, thinking, this time it will end. And that's it. There's no explanation for how Quake became a revered deity in Earth's history, or how Quake's religion assumed dominance over, say, Christianity over the millennia, or how Quake managed to go backwards in time and establish all of this in the first place. It's just time to frag and jib and we're the Marine to get the job done. In fact, in order to understand any of what was going on, I had to turn to the Quake wiki, which I will borrow from liberally in order to explain portions of the expansion's critical aspects. Dissolution of Eternity is divided into 2 episodes, and this time we can actually choose which one we want to play. Of course, we have to get past the difficulty hub first, and that is not a lean feat. In Quake, we had to leap over a bubbling pit of lava to secure the hard difficulty selection. In Scourge of Armagon, we had to perform an acrobatic leap in low gravity to reach the same selection. In Dissolution of Eternity, we have to cross a narrow walkway over a pit of lava while an earthquake rocks our footsteps and refuses to allow us gentle passage. Yes, kids, that's right, Dissolution of Eternity adds actual earthquakes to gameplay, something desperately missing from the base campaign. Why call a game Quake if you're not gonna have goddamn quakes in it? Of course, these quakes make walking horrendously unsteady, so crossing this walkway at the start is not only not easy, it took me a surprising number of times to accomplish. Taking note of this now is important, as the game is establishing here that this will be an element of gameplay at turns and will not be a steady ride. Now, I'm familiar with Rogue's previous game, Strife. It's a game that I'm not fond of and will talk about someday. After reading the sparse introduction that makes no goddamn sense, and after being trolled by the hard difficulty selection, I prepared my heart and soul for a bad time. Something told me that Rogue was gonna start fucking with me from point 1 and never let up. Boy, was I wrong. Episode 1, Hell's Fortress, gets down to business almost immediately. Where Scourge of Armagon never provided enough firepower to justify the volume of monsters bearing down on the player, Dissolution of Eternity says, "Hold my beer," and dumps an entirely new arsenal into Ranger's infinite pockets. The grenade launcher and rocket launcher have upgrades where they both fire multiple explosive projectiles at a time. The lightning gun gets an upgrade where it can release concentrated balls of plasma that explode into chain lightning. And best of all, my personal favorite, are the lava nails. red-hot pokers fired at high velocity from your nail gun of choice, doling out 30% more damage than regular nails. Just the visual of the nail gun's barrels glowing red is enough to get a rise out of a nerd like me, and unleashing said firestorm is blissful power fantasy. There's no question that this time around, Quake is built for speed, Quake is built for action, and it feels shockingly good to leap from point to point, dumping an entire army's worth of munitions on our foes. 2 new power-ups help propel the power fantasy. An anti-grav belt provides the ability to leap high overhead and rain down rockets, and the power shield actually gives Ranger a significant defensive boost. Bullet sponge enemies fold impressively fast in the face of these upgrades, and Ranger, it seems, has now truly become the man who knocks. Of course, Rogue isn't content with simply allowing the player to become Ranger the Doomslayer. Multiple new enemies are here to provide obstacles and target practice. A new version of the Ogre, creatively referred to as the multi-grenade Ogre, launches the same multi-grenades that we gather for our own use. They're just slightly different enough in color and temperament as to stand out from other ogres, and thankfully so, because they're no softballs. We also encounter the swimming electric eel, which steps in for the rotfish this time around. The Phantom Swordsman, a chopping, swinging medieval blade possessed of a poltergeist. The Hellspawns, which are green versions of the blue bastards that can replicate themselves if you don't take them out fast enough. And last, but not least, the Wrath. Wrath is used as a singular and plural word, although encountering multiple Wrath at once may require a quick load sooner versus later. The Wrath are directly related to this game's boss, the Overlord, who is responsible for the time travel tomfoolery. Wrath take the appearance of dark wizards, floating about and above the player, lobbing spiked homing orbs similar to the Vor. Unlike the Vor, however, their homing orbs don't do nearly as much damage, and when they've reached the bottom of their HP, Wrath will curl up and literally explode, so don't stand too close. The titular Hell's Fortress is the Overlord's base of operations, and as we progress through the episode, the aesthetics present a fascinating synthesis of medieval and technological, similar to the Rift and Scourge of Armagon. If you, like me, were playing all of Quake in order, this episode represents what I like to call the kitchen sink experience. Everything seen or heard in previous maps and experiences of Quake are all thrown into one excessive and exciting series of events. Dark hallways, flickering torches, power generators and occult magic, pits of lava, castles, arcane libraries, stone and steel, and all of this and more wrapped up in a shiny new coat of paint and presented with trail blazing speed. And, not to mention, traps galore. In Quake, I wondered who made all of those traps that we encountered. The nail cannons, the guillotines, the wall crushers. Who were they made for? What were they trying to keep out? In Dissolution of Eternity, the answer is very clear. You. You are the monster now. You are the invader, and the Overlord's minions are dropping everything they can in your path to keep you at bay. I oftentimes read opinions on the internet about how the first Quake had fast, vicious gameplay, which makes me scratch my head. Did we play the same game? Because yes, as Quake evolved over time, single-player experiences became more and more fast-paced, more and more oriented towards bunny-hopping, rocket-jumping chaos. But in the beginning, it was slower, more oppressive nightmare fuel, more survival than anything else. Now, after playing Dissolution of Eternity, I'm convinced that they're simply conflating all of Quake 1 with this expansion, because this is the sweaty, adrenaline-fueled, rocket-powered mayhem that I didn't know I was missing from my Quake experience. The finale of Hell's Fortress, Tomb of the Overlord, is a furiously medieval environment, culminating in a fight against the Overlord himself, a four-limbed, heavy version of the Wrath with similar abilities. Defeating the Overlord, in what is surprisingly easy with multi-rockets as the key, grants passage through a slip gate curiously bound alongside what look like Grecian pillars. The chapter's ending text reveals that the remaining Wrath have been dispersed to meander aimlessly throughout time, all while intrusive thoughts tell Ranger to beg for Quake's mercy. Of course, we're not at the end of it all quite yet, what with an entire episode left in this portion of the Quake narrative. After playing through all of Hell's Fortress in one blissfully sweaty session, I had to break for the day to regain my composure. Rogue had pulled the rug out from underneath my feet. I had expected trolling and instead encountered treasure. But still, there was one more episode to go, and what an episode it is. Episode 2, The Corridors of Time, is arguably the strongest episode in the entirety of Quake. Pulp fantasy from beginning to end, Ranger lands deep in the past of Earth's history and must slowly battle his way across epochs, destroying 3 Time Guardians who are maintaining Quake's hold on the timeline, as well as a younger version of the Overlord. It isn't enough to simply best him in the future, we need to curb stomp this son of a gun in the past as well, otherwise he might grow up and get some unsavory ideas in the future. This adventure means Ranger is required to journey from ancient Greece to ancient Egypt to ancient Mexico and make a few stops along the occult pathways while doing so. As I was playing through this episode, barely able to contain my awe and glee as I did, I couldn't help but wonder how John Romero must have felt about this particular expansion pack. After all, March 1997 was right about the time he began initial development on Daikatana, a time-traveling first-person shooter using the Quake engine. His Ancient Greece was a lot different from this Ancient Greece, but I can't help but picture Romero playing through this expansion to this point and then slowly putting his head in his hands, whispering to himself,
"Oh, man, they just won't let me do anything, will they?"
Each of the eras has their own tricks and gimmicks, which play exceptionally well. The Greece map has stone statues that animate themselves to attack you. They're essentially reskins of the Death Knight with the same attacks and sound effects, but that part doesn't matter. What does matter is that each time they're deployed, you are going to think you know exactly when they're going to stir to motion. You don't. Each encounter is an exquisite surprise. Then, the Egyptian level tasks the player with searching through an underground tomb, replete with mummies, and even a mummy queen. Remember the path, it tells you, as it provides a glimpse of a model of the maze below the sands, before throwing you headfirst into said maze without a handhold. It was at this point that I realized Brendan Fraser would make an excellent ranger in a feature film. The Wizard's Mansion doubles as the medieval area of the lot, implying that the Overlord is much older than we initially realized. Either that, or part of Quake's plot was to implant the Overlord here, as he and his Wrath minions all carry a visual element of dark wizardry. Either way, the map is a blast. The last of our time travel maps is the Aztec one, and it might possibly be my favorite. Raiding a temple devoted to bloody sacrifice, Ranger must surmount pits of lava, ceiling crushers, and saw blades embedded in the floor. Each one of these timeline maps is crafted with intricate, exquisite, new textures and set decorations, lending a remarkably realistic, though no less exaggerated, feel to the Indiana Jones-like adventure of it all. I would love to see some key artwork or posters devoted to Dissolution of Eternity, perhaps with Ranger rocket jumping over a menagerie of minions across time, with the title set in that classic Jones font. Aside from the Overlord, there are a few aforementioned mini-bosses in this episode that we must conquer in the form of the Guardians. Each one holds command over the portal at the end of their respective maps, and each are dressed in period-appropriate garb. Quake's Guardian, the Egyptian Guardian, and Quake's High Priest will emerge from the ground as though formed directly out of the environment, wielding a staff that releases bursts of deadly energy. Each of these arenas are simple, straightforward, yet hold just enough challenge to make them feel intimidating. But you know what I haven't talked about yet? The 1-2 punch of the 2 finest maps that I have thus far had the pleasure of playing in any version of Quake that I have played. Once we're through the Ancient Greece map, titled, appropriately, Tempus Fugit, we're whisked away to a strange in-between realm dominated by the 4 elements: Earth, Air, Water, and Fire, in that order. Elemental Fury 1 has Ranger racing through environments set around Earth and Air, while the next map, Elemental Fury 2, sets him against the obstacles of Water and Fire. Now, in my time on this channel, talking about different games and such, I've had my strong opinions on gimmicks in gameplay. When gimmicks feel like gimmicks, boy oh boy, do they bother me. But if you take a gimmick, tie it together with theming, and then execute it with flair, man oh man, do they make me smile. At the end of the fire section are 3 lava men, named Hephaestus in the manual, that we must defeat in order to activate switches to run to the end, and these mini-bosses utilize the character model and animations of Chthon from Quake, only downsized slightly. It's little things like this that just make me grin like a kid. Episode 2's penultimate level is titled Last Bastion, essentially a puzzle and enemy gauntlet through which we run like a pile driver, and then, at last, is the episode's final boss, the Overlord's pet dragon. We get to fight a fucking dragon at last. Early screenshots of Quake 1 featured the promise of battling dragons during the course of the campaign, something that had to be scrapped due to inconsistent pathfinding for the dragon's AI. Now, Rogue has fulfilled that promise. There's an anti-gravity belt in front of us as we enter the arena, and lots of health and ammo surrounding us. It's all very needed as the dragon spits volleys of fire which are intensely deadly. I have to admit, while mechanically the boss is a little underwhelming, the incoming fire is so merciless and the dragon tanks so much damage that it doesn't matter. What matters is staying alive, and if we can do so, we're off to activate 4 final switches to admit entrance to the time portal generator. We blow it up, and then that's it. Mischief managed. The ground shudders as reality shifts back to its predestined path. You run to enter the charged time pod, scrambling in as the chamber closes. Your consciousness fades as you realize you have halted Quake's plans for the dissolution of eternity. Fuck you! A title drop right at the very end as we're assured that all is once again right with time and space. Fuck you! What deliciously chewy, pulpy writing. Absolutely delightful. What strikes me as odd while playing through this expansion is simply how modern it feels. The sense of speed, of high damage output, of different enemies placed in different areas to create a sense of uniquity, different senses of style throughout the environments to keep everything fresh. The modern wave of first-person shooters, lovingly referred to as boomer shooters, carry every single one of these sensibilities. Yet I don't know that I've ever seen anyone specifically refer to Dissolution of Eternity as a direct inspiration. If not, they should come back and play this and see how they feel about it. Everything that I've played in the past 5 years, from Dusk to a Medieval to Hrot to Cultic, all present similar vibes as Dissolution of Eternity. It's in the way the game constructs environmental hazards and puzzles, not simply a gross amount of enemies to surmount and a large number of guns to wield while doing so. Constant speed, constant tension, constant fun to be had. What's more surprising is that in my research of this expansion, I've come across many fan reactions online stating how bland they felt Dissolution of Eternity is. Never have I ever had such whiplash as I did reading those expressions after finishing this experience. Bland? High-powered, thrill-a-minute, explosive time travel escapades? Bland? If this is ho-hum, I'd hate to see what actually excites those gamers. As I've been writing about this expansion, it occurs to me, it ought to make me angry. Where's the claustrophobic and oppressive atmosphere of Quake that I value so much? Where's the madness, the hurt, the ache that surprised me while playing the game this time around? Gone, certainly, replaced by a goofy pulp atmosphere and little connective tissue. And yet, Dissolution of Eternity, despite the amplified speed and utter destruction on display, is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting narratively in the background. Consider the opening hub here, where that stylized Q icon for the entire Quake series is suspended above us on the ceiling. That Q has been transcribed into the background of the whole of the game, from base campaign to expansion to expansion. Even in the game's primary font, that stylized Q appears over and over. Sure, at face value, the concept itself is a neat little tongue-in-cheek watermark. Quake, the game. Quake, the logo, presenting itself over and over, even on the armor of the ogres. Outside of representing the series, that logo appears to be simple set dressing and little more. But Dissolution of Eternity is establishing that watermark as more than that. It appears over and over, symbolically representing Quake the character, Shub-Niggurath herself, whose visage in-game even resembles that icon. Or, as this expansion posits, does the icon resemble her? Seeing that Q in-game has always felt like a nice little self-referential bit, until I saw that Q on the temple in the Grecian map. The shape of the portal at the end of the map, also forming that Q. Over and over throughout this expansion, the Q appears, representing Quake, Shub-Niggurath, and her power, her influence. Now, every instance of the Q within the game holds different weight. A stamp, a mark, a clear indicator of the madness and control of Quake, which, if we were to follow that logic to its next conclusion, draws into suspicion the fabled quad damage power-up here in the game. The mark of Quake imbuing Ranger with the ability to deliver 4 times the amount of damage he normally can. Is quad damage provided directly by Shub-Niggurath? Is this a taste of the madness that all her children possess? And, furthermore, as each new entry in the Quake series bears its own version of the Q icon, does this imply, then, the influence and shadow of Shub-Niggurath looming over everything related to the series? Because she is Quake. Quake is the Hellmother, the true villain of the entire franchise. Whether we're facing Strogg or fighting up the ranks of the Arena Eternal, it was and always has been the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, whose influence consumes all. Before Dissolution of Eternity, I would have never considered this possibility, and yet this grandiose cavalcade of chaos provided just enough evidence for me to be unable to see it any other way. Dissolution of Eternity is doing so much work that I can't help but marvel at it, and what subtle grace it has at it. Yes, outwardly, it is tricks, traps, monsters, mayhem, time travel, god friggin' damn, this can't be happening, and yet in the background, the workings of Quake are manipulating the surrounding environment. It's manipulating us. Now we're the monster, carving our path not simply through space, but time now, with traps established across centuries to keep us out. Within 3 simple campaigns, we've gone from seeing a world operated by hurt, to crawling out of that collapsing world, to becoming the hurt within that world. Our angst has escalated throughout the events of it all. Now we've come full circle and are experiencing that rush for ourselves. Scourge of Armagon maybe didn't quite understand the monsters that it was playing with, but Dissolution of Eternity sure does. Both expansions deliver on solid visuals, solid design, and solid gameplay, evolving out of the strife of id Software's original in ways I couldn't have predicted. I'm mad. I'm so mad for not playing these expansions sooner. Then again, I don't know that I would have had the perspective that I do now to be able to gently pick apart the layers and see what was beneath them. I'm a simple guy. I love Quake. I love Quake in all its forms. And for the longest time I thought, you know what? Only id Software should do Quake. Nobody else does it like they do. Which makes me a fool. On one hand, I'm right. Nobody does Quake like id Software. But id Software didn't even want to do Quake. At least, not how it happened. That world, and that ache, and that hurt cannot be replicated outside of the environment which id Software unfortunately found themselves in 1996. But those ideas and those worlds have successfully shown over the last 30 years that they can be translated into different but equally potent worlds and campaigns. Whether staring into the abyss of madness, or escaping gothic cathedrals, or tearing gleefully through time, Quake's tone may change, but the coherency remains. Madness and hurt and ache still animate these adventures, all of them through different looking glasses. Still, for as cathartic a joyride as Dissolution of Eternity is, we know that this isn't the end of Ranger's adventures. True, as far as we were concerned in 1997, here ends the journey of Ranger, Slipgate Marine, hero of space and time, conqueror of the Hellmother. Just a few months after Dissolution of Eternity released, id Software once again dropped a banger with the release of Quake 2, a game that stepped far and away from the atmosphere and setting of Quake 1 and into more familiar territory for the studio. 1999's Quake 3 Arena would marry the two games from an aesthetic perspective, trimming away all the fat into a lean, mean, arcade deathmatch machine. And yet here, Ranger once again appeared. His placement within Quake 3 felt like a callback, as did many of the other selectable characters in that game, but his biography in the manual and in the strategy guide told an interesting story. Ranger has paid the ultimate sacrifice for his world. Trained to protect the Earth at all costs and dedicated to no other task, Ranger was sent through slipgate after slipgate, from world to world and from battle to battle. He survived, partly by luck and mostly by skill. After so many battles, there is little of the original man left. Even his real name is gone. He knows his world is safe, but he also knows there is no way back home. Quake 3 retroactively established Ranger's journeys, and subsequently the expansions themselves, as the first-person shooter equivalent of Quantum Leap. Ranger, despite everything we experience, never returns home. Instead, he hopped from realm to realm, constantly chasing down the forces of Quake, fending off her influence. Whatever happened to Ranger between stepping into the time pod and emerging into the Arena Eternal would remain shrouded in mystery for close to 20 years, until a plucky fan of Quake would drop a new set of levels to celebrate the game's anniversary, unintentionally setting in motion the path to brand new canon content for fans. This portion of the script has seen the most rewrites, because Dimension of the Past is the portion of Quake that I have changed my mind about the most. At first I bounced right off of it. It was too hard, too stingy, too mean to the player. I didn't like it. But then I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I tried it again. I found a rhythm here, one which I didn't think was potential, and yet stubbornly held my ground and I made my way through. Thus did I believe that I finally saw the expansion for what it was and what I believed it could and should be. And yet, still, here I am again, pondering the orb, as it were, considering yet another run through Dimension of the Past, wondering now if I actually do like it more than I think I do, or if I'm simply dedicated to making this hard-as-balls map pack my little bitch. Unlike the expansions from 1997, Dimension of the Machine doesn't bring any new gameplay, or weaponry, or enemies to the Quake table. In the modding community, this is what's known as a vanilla mod, in which the mod only utilizes textures and monsters and weapons found in the base game. It's sort of a back-to-basics approach, which, at first, I found refreshing. After the escalating innovation from Scourge of Armagon to Dissolution of Eternity, a quick gear shift back down into straightforward, ominous quaking seemed a delightful change of pace. However, as the map pack quickly revealed itself, this is anything but straightforward quaking. The world of hurt that Quake inhabits, that it represents, has been reshaped into a world of punishment here in Dimension of the Past, and the recipient of said punishment is the player. It's worth noting to begin with that Dimension of the Past did not begin life as an official expansion for Quake. That official status wouldn't come to be until the release of the 2021 remaster, a choice which makes sense in context. Dimension of the Past debuted online in 2016 for Quake's 20th anniversary as a free map pack designed by Jörg Gustafsson of Machine Games, and the whole of Machine Games developed the subsequent chapter of Quake, 2021's Dimension of the Machine, but we'll get to that in a moment. Dimension of the Past, then, was a side project for Gustafsson, a labor of love to celebrate one of his favorite games, despite the fact that now the whole of Machine Games is credited with the existence of this expansion. History is muddled on the whys and hows of this map pack, sometimes stating that Machine Games made the expansion, sometimes stating that Gustafsson created the pack solo, while Machine Games as a studio released the expansion for free. What I've been able to find indicates that it was Gustafsson himself who should get sole credit for the expansion pack's creation and release. An old download page on QAddicted.com credits the author of the expansion to be J.F. Gustafsson, and that the official title of the set is Episode 5, Dimension of the Past. A bold statement to establish itself as the 5th episode of Quake. I'm going to ignore that. The reason I'm going to ignore that is because Scourge of Armagon quite clearly takes place after the ending of Quake, and the ending of Quake is the finale against Shub-Niggurath, which occurs once all 4 episodes of that game have been completed. This is a nitpick, perhaps, but once we dive into the meat of the expansion, I believe you'll see why. But first, a little history. Once upon a time, Swedish game designers Starbreeze Studios developed a series of first-person shooters that wowed gamers. 2004's The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay, 2007's The Darkness, and 2009's half-remake, half-sequel, The Chronicles of Riddick: Assault on Dark Athena. However, midway through 2009, 7 members of the team felt that Starbreeze was getting too big, and they left Starbreeze to found Machine Games, only to nearly stall out within their first 2 years of existence, brainstorming project after project and pitching to various publishers, which bore no fruit. Faced with potentially closing down, Machine Games had a moment of brilliant serendipity when Bethesda came knocking on their doors, impressed with the studio's body of work from their Starbreeze days, and offered them the opportunity to work on one of their intellectual properties. As it turns out, Bethesda had recently acquired id Software and their IPs, so when Jens Mathies of Machine Games saw that no one was doing anything with Wolfenstein, he politely inquired if that could be their next project. One thing led to another, and the result was 2014's Wolfenstein: The New Order, a game designed by Gustafsson and co-directed by Mathies and Gustafsson. Since then, Machine Games has primarily worked within id Software's oeuvre, developing 4 additional Wolfenstein games, including 2017's Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, 3 Quake-related expansions between both Quake 1 and 2, 2024's Doom expansion, Legacy of Rust, which was developed in conjunction with id Software and Night Dive Studios, and then they returned to a slightly different kind of Nazi-smashing action with 2024's Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Dimension of the Past takes place across 8 levels, 1 secret level, and includes a new deathmatch map. On a curious side note, with the 2021 remaster, Dimension of the Past received a fresh coat of paint as well as a second secret map. Why they would include a new secret map is anyone's guess, but that polish and inclusion are probably why Machine Games has been retroactively credited with the development of the expansion. Since this pack isn't a multi-episodic adventure, the skill selection hub is simple as, and we're treated to an ominous-looking slipgate before being whisked away into the void. Dimension of the Past doesn't have a story in the same way the other expansions do. There's no setup, there's no clear indication of why Ranger is pursuing threats through this series of punishing events, and even the final text roll is a blasé pat on the back for defeating challenging monsters. "You are a true ranger," it declares, but there's no context, no understanding. I don't require an in-depth narrative for my gaming needs. Dissolution of Eternity basically said, go back in time and blow shit up, and I said, thank you very much. But Dimension of the Past, despite waving the banner of being Episode 5, feels less like a fully realized expansion and more like a word salad fever dream. These 8 maps, or 10, if you count the secret maps, is a whiz-bang journey through Quake's greatest hits. A remix of sorts that impeccably captures the vibes of the base campaign. Thus far in the video, I've made analogous comparisons to films and sequels. Direct-to-video, direct-to-DVD. Dimension of the Past feels like a made-for-streaming soft reboot. The kind of flick that extracts the subtitle so as not to give away that this is a sequel of any kind, instead presented as a slight reimagining, but a serious one, obviously. This is the adult sequel, the one for the big kids, none of that silly time travel or general armagon business. Instead, it just goes fucking hard. The expansion moves swiftly through the 4 main aesthetics of Quake. Military base, medieval castle, industrial complex, occult temple, all while throwing every major enemy in your path tenfold while reducing the amount of ammunition one would normally expect from such a venture. After all, you have been playing Quake for the last 20 years, haven't you? Aren't you prepared to face down 30 Death Knights and 12 Shamblers while 6 Vor lob homing orbs at you? If not, then that's on you for stepping into these halls. Get good, buddy. This is motherfucking Quake. There's quite a bit to enjoy about Dimension of the Past, most especially the visuals. Back to basics. That's the motto. That's the fascinating hook at the edges of Dimension of the Past. It's a neat little rocket ride through the game's history, and, in one sense, possibly through the twisted memories that Ranger has of his journey to destroy Shub-Niggurath. I do like that implication, that this realm, or dimension as it states, guides its occupants through some of their worst experiences. In this case for Ranger, he's drawn right back through the traumatic escapade which began his entire foray through the Dreamlands. To hammer this home, the final map is Shub-Niggurath's Pit, the place where we telefragged the Hellmother so long ago, except this time, she's absent. In her place are multiple eldritch beasts, almost exclusively Shamblers and Vor, and Ranger's task is to claw his way through the hordes down into a secret chamber below where Shub-Niggurath once stood, to a portal that resembles the iconic difficulty hub of the base game, and out we go. It's a fascinating concept to circle all the way back around to the arena of the final boss and explore its hidden paths. What makes it so frustrating, however, is the requirement of killing all the Shamblers in the map in order to unseal the exit portal, which is not just simply daunting, it requires a near surgical execution of ammo tracking and utilization in order to do so. I spent nearly 10 minutes in the last chamber of the map alone, low on health, low on ammunition, quick loading over and over to defeat the 2 remaining Shamblers, my resources whittled down to only my axe time and time again. Eventually, I got the job done, but by this time the potential catharsis of this victory had also been whittled down to the simple need to be fucking done with this episode. It's this map, by the way, which is responsible for my umbrage at the notion of this being Quake's missing episode 5. You can play any of the base game's 4 episodes in any order you'd like, so there's no correct way to go about it. What matters is that you collect the 4 runes necessary for unlocking Shub-Niggurath's Pit, where the boss fight awaits. Dimension of the Past's finale is centered within the now empty pit, where the Hellmother once resided. Empty now because Ranger pulled an Ant-Man and blew that twisted bitch to smithereens. How, then, could this be Quake's episode 5 if he needs to complete episodes 1 through 4 and then the boss fight first in order for the pit to be vacant? The nitpicky answer is, it can't. Then again, the title of the finale is The Year Zero, which could then imply that Ranger has done yet another time warp exercise, one in which he is looped all the way back around to a place and time where Shub-Niggurath does not yet reside, one populated by her minions. No, Dimension of the Past as a canonical episode slots much more neatly after the escapades of Dissolution of Eternity, from not just a narrative standpoint, but from a gameplay standpoint. Were this to be experienced in the order intended, Dimension of the Past would run the gamut immediately following the elimination of Shub-Niggurath, and then land us directly right back at her now mostly empty pit. Returning so soon to such an iconic locale feels a little empty, not simply for the lack of the witch goddess. By experiencing Scourge of Armagon first, then Dissolution of Eternity, both the player and Ranger himself now are dragged back through familiar muck. Winding up at Shub-Niggurath's pit at the end hits harder when it is distanced from the finale of the base game. It holds more awe, more reverence, and frankly, more terror. Coming back to this lowest point of the Dreamlands, and then being forced to go even lower, is a really neat idea, but it needs time to breathe before actually experiencing it. Dimension of the Past's largest sin, however, one which is nearly insurmountable, is that it starves the player of resources while dumping highly resilient enemies in their way. Scourge of Armagon didn't quite understand how resilient Quake monsters are. Dimension of the Past does. So well, in fact, that it mathematically understands exactly how much ammo you need to store away in order to best the game with relative ease, and provides little overhead beyond that. At the end of the 3rd map, titled The Dark Days, there's a sequence where the player is ambushed by 2 fiends from behind, then activating 2 switches opens a door to face 2 more fiends. Between these two encounters, and after the encounters that had already come before this, I found myself so low of health and ammo that my course was alternating between dying immediately and depleting the last of the ammo I had in my reserves before finally giving up the ghost. I was able, at one point, to slip into the chamber with the exit portal, where health pickups awaited me, but my only option for finishing off the remaining fiend was close quarters combat with my axe. I chose, instead, to leave through the portal rather than attempt the final kill. Not a good feeling, that choice, but one that had to be made. I've played enough Quake to know, at times, sometimes, the best action is to run like hell and slip through the exit and survive. It's not a good feeling, because the point of a game like Quake is to clear the opposition from the board. Seeing the end of the level stats is something that we strive for, keeping our numbers high and complete. That sensation of seeing 60 out of 64 kills can hit deep when you know you could have gotten at least 1 or 2 more if only you'd had a few more rounds of buckshot. Difficult isn't the right word to describe the mutilation of the player within this set of maps. Depraved would be. Considering this was originally designed to pay tribute to the 20th anniversary of the base game, I can both understand but also not understand why this expansion felt the need to be so fucking hard. Dimension of the Past is a frustrating experience because it refuses to provide resources in the same way that Quake 1 did. Quake's mechanics revolve around the provision of enough resources to get through the day, enough to plow through a number of deadly spongy enemies, and then still have enough to open up the following map. Resource management then is key. You'll want to preserve your bigger weapons for bigger baddies, deploying them when you need to, not because you want to. Use the shotgun primarily, then swap to the nail gun if something deadly needs to be taken out quick. Swap to explosives if something deadly needs to be taken out real quick, and swap to the lightning gun if something needs to be taken out right fucking now. Your workhorse being the shotgun sets a base damage output for the player to gauge their line of attack based on what is in front of them. Quake's chessboard maintains a balance of power, one where you can and will die at any time, even to the lowest tier enemy. But the trick is that if you can maintain a steady rate of fire with the right weapons, you can survive. But that takes ammo. Bags and bags of ammo, because as previously noted earlier in the video, Quake couldn't sustain the same high number of enemies per map as Doom could, so rather than high enemy counts, fewer, tougher enemies were settled upon. So, absolutely ridiculous amounts of buckshot are a requirement. Because if you run through the cell ammo, run through the explosives, and run through your nails, it's old Betsy that is your standby. Considering that it takes at least 4 pulls from the double barrel to fell an ogre on hard, that's 8 rounds of buckshot total on 1 enemy, or 2 explosive rounds. It's 6 double barrel pulls for a death knight, so that's 12 rounds, or 3 explosive rounds, and probably something like 10 to 12 double buckshot for a shambler. I don't know, I stopped counting with them because I was too busy trying not to die. God knows how many explosive rounds it takes because shamblers are resistant to explosives. Start adding, then multiply, and take into account plenty of missed shots or partial hits, and then calculate how much ammo you need in order to clean up the monsters planned for your map. Because you can't do that if you don't have ammo. And if you're facing something like 5 Death Knights at once, which here you will, you're gonna run out of ammo fast. Which would be okay if there were more crates around the corner, but in Dimension of the Past, that's not a guarantee. Don't get me wrong, I do love a hard time when playing a game. Oddly, it seems, particularly in expansions. Hexen's Death Kings of the Dark Citadel and Doom Eternal's The Ancient Gods Part 1 are some of the most difficult yet satisfying gaming experiences I've ever had, and I would sit down to play them again in a heartbeat. But what I don't enjoy is when the scales tip over from difficult to frustrating, from punishing to mean. Dimension of the Past is mean. Perhaps it's meant to be a challenge pack, and if so, great. But if it is, it's not advertised. And if this were simply a map pack homage to the greatness of Quake when it was, at the time, 20 years old, I wouldn't be complaining as I am. But this is a canon expansion now. This is a bona fide, certified Quake experience and part of the Ranger's journey now. In an attempt to give credit where credit is due, I replayed Dimension of the Past on normal difficulty rather than on hard, which is my personal preference when it comes to Quake. I've played through all of the base game and both of the 97 expansions on hard, and across all three, I had a linear experience of surmountable difficulty. Just enough pushback so that I did not feel overpowered, but not so much that I felt like I couldn't get through. On normal difficulty, Dimension of the Past provides the same amount of pushback that I generally am accustomed to on hard mode, so perhaps this is a challenge pack after all. Then again, even on normal, there were times when I still ran out of ammo. Not as often, nor nearly as much, but I genuinely blinked in surprise when I found myself holding an axe with still 2 Death Knights bearing down on me. Despite all of this, the visual and level design values alone here are exemplary. Running through on normal certainly solidified for me that Gustafsson at least understands the aesthetics and atmosphere of Quake. Operating with the original 9 Inch Nails score in the background, thanks to the remaster's workings, each map feels drawn together out of pieces of a whole, something lost, now since remembered, but remembered wrong. We've all had those moments where we've attempted to recollect something important, an event, or a person, or a place, nearly defined within our mind, but just slightly fuzzy and out of reach. Gustafsson takes the experience of the first Quake and boils it down to a mistaken memory, as though Ranger, as already theorized, is returning to the dramatic journey through those 4 dimensions all over again. But how many Death Knights were there again? Did that military base have toxic water in it? Which turn exactly was it to find the exit? My favorite map, one which gave me no small amount of agony, is the secret map, The House of Doom. In theory, it's quite simple, a bunch of narrow corridors looping around a central area with stairs that go up and down, and you have to find 4 pillars that unlock the exit. Again, simple, straightforward, and yet the lack of signposting and the repetition of the same textures work to create a kind of liminal space of having been here before, and yet still completely lost. Once you've discovered the 4 pillars, a message appears stating, "A door to hell has opened." It's no exaggeration either. Bubbling lava below the map leads to 2 more Vor and a final Shambler to defeat before exiting. That's great stuff. That's good Quake design. Amidst all of this are dozens of Death Knights, no less than 8 Vor scattered throughout multiple nights, and that one final Shambler, that last little fuck you towards the player. There are just barely enough resources strewn about the map as to tackle these foes, but if you're spraying and praying wantonly without attention to your ammo pool, chances are strong you'll be stranded with only your axe left for offense. Dimension of the Past encapsulates the feeling of ache, of angst, felt all throughout the whole of Quake, and then distills it back and around towards the player themselves. In this dimension, it hurts to exist, and while I did not allow this expansion to defeat me, it was exhausting at all points. After writing this section of the script, I gave due consideration to the idea that maybe, just maybe, I was, in fact, being an old man about all of this. Something about the expansion continued to reach out towards me. Something, perhaps, in the construction of the levels and the overall vibes, particularly the 2 secret levels. Unlike any of the other expansions, or even the base game, I couldn't shake the sensation that I needed to give this experience just one more try. So I sat down, put on my big boy pants, and played again on hard, this time determined to not let it undermine me. It was about halfway through the expansion's other secret level, the Forgotten Castle, that the rhythm clicked and the vision became clear. Slowly but surely, chipping away at enemies, burst firing the nail gun, lobbing a single grenade at a time, kiting monsters into groups to take advantage of splash damage, swapping to the double barrel to finish off kills, and saving the lightning gun for only Vor or Shamblers. And without warning, suddenly, I was at the year 0 again, happily topped up on health, with a decent reserve of ammo and a quad damage in sight. I plowed through that map like a butcher, still sustaining quite a bit of damage along the way. At the end, I had 8 HP left and 48 shotgun shells, with one final Shambler to go. I emerged the victor. Dimension of the Past is, yes, a rough beast. It takes more precision, more acuity to get through this expansion, which I can appreciate in doses. The rest of Quake I can sit and play through in large chunks, but Dimension of the Past required breaks. At the end of it, the concept, the visuals, the level design all speak to me. The gameplay and the ammo starvation do not, but I think I understand it a little better after playing through it 3 times now. Will I return to it quickly? Who's to say? Because as mentioned before, a sea change has happened within me, even while thinking about the game during this edit. Like encroaching madness, it whispers in my ear, beckoning me to return and show it just one more time how I'm not gonna take any of its bullshit. And I won't. No, god damn it, I won't take any of its bullshit. It's a remarkable entry into the Quake canon, yet one that first-time players or even casual gamers may or may not latch onto at a first go. This is not designed to be in line with how previous expansions played. This is not designed to be in line with even how the base game played. Dimension of the Past is a harsh, despondent escalation of violence and a deprivation of resources. It demands more while taking away what you need to accomplish these desperate tasks. Maybe, just like Death Kings of the Dark Citadel and Ancient Gods Part 1, I like it a little rougher than I let on. While I still have some qualms with the expansion, I came back, I conquered it, walked away with a smile, and yet am still looking over my shoulder with longing to return. Get fucking good indeed. Fatigued though I was by Dimension of the Past, the follow-up, 2021's Dimension of the Machine, still sat waiting. I didn't play this one upon the remaster's release, but I had seen clips, screenshots, and I'd heard word of nothing short of excellence. Understanding Machine Games' resume by this point, and now cautious after my experience with Jörg Gustafsson's first foray into official expansion territory, I loaded up this final chapter of Quake with a sense of dread throughout my system. Turns out there was no need. Dimension of the Machine is, arguably, Quake's finest hour, and certainly its most intriguing from a narrative standpoint. With the whole of Machine Games' development team on hand, Dimension of the Machine is easily the most polished Quake experience, possibly even more so than the base game itself. Blasphemy, I know, but everything great about Quake is fresh here. No leftovers, no reheats. There are no new enemies, no new weapons, but new environments, vastly different environments, and the expansion takes full advantage of the remaster's new lighting effects and texture maps. Where once Lovecraft was the thematic inspiration for Quake, with this expansion, the scope broadens into a more vast, unknowable cosmic horror, less invested in the twisted tentacular madness that Lovecraft would pen, instead turning its gaze upwards towards the stars, towards what might be hiding in that unknowable void, and whether or not we should know what it is. Those of you familiar with the writings of William Hope Hodgson will understand this aesthetic shift immediately. While there is no story set up per se, there is a threadbare narrative woven across the 5 chapters of Dimension of the Machine, pronounced through implications rather than overt prose. Really, the story here in this expansion is, bar none, my favorite in everything we've investigated in this video, and I am pleased beyond words to explore it. Dimension of the Machine opens up with the now familiar difficulty selection screen, but here lies an ominous twist. Rather than appearing on the fringes of reality or some unknown world, Ranger awakens deep within an industrial factory, surrounded by brick, metal pipes, chains, and what appears to be the setting of a cultic ritual. Blood, body parts, and bewildering symbols. After choosing the difficulty, we're taken to the main hub, still set within the same ironworks, still surrounded by arcane symbols, painted on the environments in what appears to be blood. Candles burn, molten lava runs beneath our feet, and banners high above suggest that this isn't simply the work of a rogue group, but that all of this is as intentional as it gets. Welcome to the machine. A machine for what, being the question. Our goal is to power the machine by collecting 5 runes and placing them within their corresponding pedestals. The machine requires 6 runes, but we only need to collect 5 because a dead Slipgate Marine already collected 1 and died after deposit. Who is he? Why did he go after that rune? What killed him? Without even leaping into the first of the 5 portals that we've access to, there's already so many questions about what the hell is going on. Answers eventually come in the form of implication, and those answers really only appear deep into the game's narrative, depending on the order which you tackle the game, that is. 5 portals, 5 chapters. The realms of the machinists, the blacksmiths, the stonemasons, the cultists, and the astrologers. Curious that each of these realms is named after specific groups, not just some abstract concept or notion. Each realm represents one chapter of the expansion. Each chapter contains 2 maps to fight our way through to discover their respective runes. We can play through them in any order, just as we could in the base game, but if we move through them in a specific order, that subtextual narrative unfurls like a spring blossom, slowly revealing its beauty to us as well as the damnation of those who have come before. Turns out that I did exactly that. I've always been one to move through a map from left to right, perhaps trained by the visual of Quake's original 4 chapters. So naturally, I did the same thing with Dimension of the Machine, and perhaps unintentionally discovered the intended pathway for the story. Without the benefit of a written prologue, the player is left to imagine why, exactly, Ranger has found himself here in this machine, although if one had been playing Quake for 25 plus years at the time of release, then much setup wasn't necessary. Quake, the enemy figure, has continued to maintain her invasion of madness throughout the Earth realm, and so the Slipgate Marines are constantly on the defense, pushing back against the Hellmother's influence. Except this time, it wasn't a push back against the Eldritch Goddess that instigated the horror of this expansion, it was a push forward. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the narrative, first, a summary. Dimension of the Machine tasks Ranger with traveling through the 5 active portals in the machine, collecting the runes within each and returning them to power up the machine and enter the final portal. What lies beyond this portal? It's our old foe Chthon, who I've already teased would make a return, now here resplendent in all his fiery glory. We have to fight him once more, except this time it's a bit more visceral and much more direct than his button puzzle level in Quake 1. In this boss arena, Chthon rests in the center of the arena's dominating pit of lava, and only the lightning gun is powerful enough to make him sink back down into it. The game even tells us that, so there's no confusion about what we need to attack the Elder God with. It's a nice callback to the lightning generator method of dispatching the boss beforehand, and explains why we weren't able to defeat him ourselves back in the day. Episode 1 of Quake had no lightning gun, so how else were we supposed to put him down? Much like before, Chthon must be pushed back down into the lava 3 times to defeat him and win the day, but this time, he's got friends. Lots of friends. Deadly little fodder enemies inhabit the arena, enough to make our fight that much more difficult than it would be otherwise. Chthon's signature fireballs still hit like a motherfucker, so between those and the monsters of this arena, this is genuinely a tough fight. Collect a silver and a gold key, unlock their respective switches, fell Chthon, and then we're out. But hold on, Dad, you're surely saying. If we defeated Chthon once already, how is he here once more? Shub-Niggurath is gone, so shouldn't Chthon be dead as well? The answer to that question lies in the lore of Quake Champions. Love that game or hate it, and I hate it, Quake Champions performed backflips unifying and solidifying the lore behind every single Quake game, drawing them all together into a single continuity that somehow makes sense. In Quake Champions, it's revealed that Chthon was the overseer of the Dimension of the Doomed in Quake 1, but after his defeat at the hands of Ranger, Chthon was exiled to a pocket dimension, and another Elder God named Goroth took Chthon's place. Here, in this arena, we find Chthon in exile, pissed off and ready for revenge. However, Chthon wasn't just sitting here this entire time waiting for Ranger to make his way in and then have a little heart-to-heart. While not explicitly stated, the purpose of the titular machine was to release Chthon from his exile. Machinists, blacksmiths, stonemasons, cultists, astrologers. 5 separate castes, 5 different runes, all absolutely necessary for constructing a machine able to unlock time and space. Of course, there was a sixth cast that shall remain forever lost to us, thanks to the efforts of the unknown space marine, so we can only speculate as to their role. But the machinists, through Chthon's influence, designed the blueprints for the machine. The blacksmiths crafted the steel for it. The stonemasons, the bricks. The cultists imbued the machine with dark occult energies, and the astrologers used the stars to fix the machine's sights upon its proper target. All of this information is inferred rather than delivered to the player, and it is magnificent that the visuals and level design alone put in so much work to do so. But one curiosity remains. If Chthon was exiled, and if this machine was built with the purpose of releasing him from said exile, then why are the minions of Shub-Niggurath here? There are no new enemies to be found, unlike in previous expansions, so there's no reason to believe that the puppets of the witch goddess are attempting to go against orders and release her prisoner. My money is on the notion that the monsters here were placed by Shub-Niggurath to prevent anyone from collecting the runes and letting Chthon out. It certainly falls in line with the worlds we visit in Quake 1, where the remaining monsters simply mill about, waiting for conflict, angry and trembling with violent agony, preventing the collection of the 4 runes that unlock passage to Shub-Niggurath's pit. But what I believe happens here is that Chthon was able to exude just enough influence over the humans of our realm after Shub-Niggurath's defeat to get them to come searching for his machine and to finish it. This is something that builds over the course of the expansion. Dimension of the Machine, unlike any other experience in Quake, crafts a sustained tension that builds and builds with each chapter. A sensation of utter dread continues to mount as we explore these realms. What is happening here? What is this machine? Why are we collecting these runes? What the hell is going to happen when we finish it? Doubling down on this dread is a very clear idea that we're visiting dead worlds. Every caste that once resided in these worlds are all gone now, culled by Shub-Niggurath's minions into non-existence. Every planet we reach is dead. Evidence of destruction abound. Buildings toppled, industrial services fractured, piles of bodies strewn here and there. And these chapters are huge. Massive, wide open areas and looming architecture and gaping chasms to explore. Couple the environmental storytelling with the sense of scope in each map, reducing the player to something minuscule within a vast scheme long since completed and older than we can imagine, and here we have our cosmic horror. In the base game, the lurking horror around every corner was immediate, almost intimate in how close it felt. Dimension of the Machine reduces both the player and ranger to non-entity. We don't matter here. We're not preventing anything because it's already happened. Our role is that of an aggressive observer, catching up to what occurred here so long ago, brute forcing our way through to the answers. Ultimately, however, it does not matter. All we can do is complete the machine and see where it takes us. Only then do we discover any connection we might have to all of this, and as it stands, it's pure chance that it would be us who land here, who stand before an elder god yet again, an elder god who is no doubt enraged at the thought that the fucking guy responsible for his circumstances to begin with is back again. Exploring these dead worlds is absolutely haunting. Everything on display is deep and wide and so big that I felt awe and terror at the same time. Machine Games pulled out all the stops aesthetically to build this expansion and spared no expense. All of them are excellent, but to me, the showstopper is the realm of the astrologers. The first map of the chapter, Nazard Terminal, drops Ranger into a strange, purple-starred void with floating geometry and a crumbling ancient temple. Once we fought our way through the temple, a red button opens up a trap beneath our feet, and we're teleported to one of the most unexpected sights in all of Quake. A military prison ship, populated by enforcers and grunts and rottweilers, all standing guard over a block of cells holding various eldritch monsters prisoner. Back in Scourge of Armagon, I asked, who the hell would be dumb enough to capture a pair of shamblers and bring them back to Earth for study? Apparently, these idiots. Our job is to cruise through the ship, searching for a way out, and, along the way, cause a little chaos by releasing the monsters from their cages. It goes about as well as you'd expect. One fascinating note during this escapade is that the enforcers and grunts activate some measure of their former humanity, turning on the released creatures before turning on us. At the very end, a vivid, haunting experience sees Ranger booking it for the exit as the ship around him is exploding, to round a corner into a room full of slipgates, and all but one explode at his approach. Something is leading him onward, so onward we must go. The second map of the chapter, titled Too Deep, Too Greedy, finds Ranger deposited on the planet below, at the foot of some cliffs which lead him up towards a military mining facility. Large haulers sit outside, out of use. Inside are enforcers and grunts, holding guard still over the base, a sense memory of duty still holding sway. We explore the base, discovering sections blown apart, bunks with dead Marines, a mess hall complete with a meat locker holding frozen bodies of monsters. A favorite moment of mine is when the player opens a door to the mine itself, and out comes a shambler. But the nearby enforcers turn at once and start blasting away at the thing. If you leave them be, the enforcers are enough to best the beast. But then two more shamblers appear, ripping the once victorious enforcers to shreds. Visual storytelling such as this is one of my favorite things about computer games, and when executed this well, it's like magic. But the magic quickly turns to dark magic, as the path ahead leads downward into arcane spaces full of blood and skulls and blasphemous altars. Between the lava and the candlelight, the environment is lit ominously crimson. Still further down we go, through traps and hazards and death knights and shamblers, searching for hidden buttons to activate the exit. And yet, there is no exit. Further down do we go, out of the red caverns and into the darkness. Impossible constructions exist down here. A tower, platforms, and piles of marine corpses. The rune of astrologers rests on an arcane altar, hovering above a pitch-black abyss which, if we fall into it, curiously teleports us back to the altar rather than causes our doom. From there we must climb our way back upwards, clawing through an absurd number of eldritch creatures until we reach the exit, guarded by spawns, and diving through we are, at last, sent to safety. The text at the end of the chapter is beautifully written. Exalted warrior from the machine, you succeeded where the expedition failed. They came from beyond the stars on a black ship powered by captured suns. They found the oldest planet, filled their ship with the inhabitants. You delivered them vengeance. They dug out the ground at the holy site, not knowing how close they came. You hold the rune of astrologers. Return to the machine. What's especially delightful about this text is the line, "You delivered them vengeance." Depending on the context, on how we read it, the vengeance delivered may have been for the Marines who lost their lives, or for the monsters here that the Marines stirred into a frenzy. Because while at first it seems reasonable to interpret the line as providing vengeance for the fallen soldiers, the way that this voice in our heads is speaking, calling the underground a holy site, it might not be as sympathetic to the humans as we think at first. What a chapter. What a goddamn expansion. Dimension of the Machine never lets up at any point, even in its quietest moments. Because what it does is take the formula of Quake and expands it. Even more than that, it encompasses it. In the base game, the concepts of Quake are presented as ominous, foreboding, but compressed and claustrophobic. Ranger moves from specific place to specific place, sites of importance, which, while being implied to be part of a greater whole, maintains a linear focus on what is in front of you, the goal of defeating the entity known as Quake. But here, in Dimension of the Machine, the perspective broadens. It pulls out and away from those narrow corridors and underground explorations in favor of dread. What strikes me most is how large these maps are, not simply in length, but in height. Oftentimes, the sky or the ceiling or the environments yawn above Ranger, dwarfing him, implying that we are a very small fish in a very large pond that dried up a long time ago. Yet, not as old as the first 4 dimensions we ventured through. Quake 1's environments feel ancient and dead, inhabited once but no longer. But these maps, these realms, provide evidence of those inhabitants and their destruction. Long-standing cities which, up until recently, were thriving. I imagine that it is the difference between walking through the ruins of Rome now versus walking through the ruins of Rome shortly after the fall of Rome. Still, too, does the scope of the expansion widen further, out into the cosmos, especially with the realm of the astrologers displaying unshakable evidence that there are even older things which we cannot begin to fathom. Things which will remain even after we have come and gone. Dimension of the Machine is immense, full of terror, but even more than that, it's full of apathy. These puppets of Shub-Niggurath stand between us and Cthon, but these environments, they don't care. The deepest pit of the oldest planet doesn't care. It still exists. It will exist after we have died. Even Ranger is not here for the previous inhabitants. Even his path is not one of intent to discover. He moves through these environments a tourist. His apathy reflects our apathy. Does everything still hurt when we don't care about it any longer? Yes, of course it does. We can just no longer feel it. And that is terrifying. From a visual and design perspective, Dimension of the Machine is a brilliant showcase of Machine Games' talent. To continue the film analogy, Dimension of the Machine is the A24 sequel, the one with the budget and the theatrical release, because someone loved Quake enough to say, we're gonna make another one, we're gonna make it real good, and we know we have the backing to do it. Every texture, every frame, every model, lovingly presented and crafted. Gorgeous visuals, jaw-dropping environments, just brilliant through and through. I'm particularly fond of the Foundry in the realm of the blacksmiths, with its red lighting and gothic Tesla coils and arcane pillars. This one single map combines every single element of Quake, bobbing and weaving exhaustively. It's all so finely tuned and fiendishly clever. I was fit to burst after playing through the first map of the realm of the cultists, in which we're forced to descend through a temple resting over a deep cliff, only for the next map to literally flip upside down and have us ascend back up the temple by going down again. The effect was so subtle that I didn't notice at first that it was literally the same map but upside down, that I was running along the ceilings until I looked at the torches on the wall and realized that they were facing the wrong direction. Emerging above ground, even the sky had been flipped, wide open air at sunset below. How fucking clever. How deviously goddamn clever and effective. Dimension of the Machine is brilliant. It plays with a different kind of cosmic horror than the base game does, but it is no less effective in that sense. Most of its magic lies in not knowing what the hell is going on as we go along, right up until the surprise appearance of Cthon. But understanding the twist ahead of time doesn't change the mystery, the unknowableness of it all. It is fundamentally Quake. It touches on the same themes, but in a different key, while still sounding as close to the original as possible, something only achievable by a talented artist who understands the instrument they are wielding. With each brush stroke, it reminds of the original, while using a different shade of color, creating different shapes. At once, Dimension of the Machine is both homage and yet beyond that simplistic description. Were this a fully fledged sequel, it would feel correct. Should we ever get the anticipated reboot of Quake, built in the same manner as Doom 2016, I cannot imagine that it would be better than this expansion. I would like for it to be close, and I would be open to finding out firsthand. But Dimension of the Machine is not simply the best expansion for Quake. It is one of the best computer gaming experiences I have ever had, bar none, and that is a remarkable feat. When Quake launched in 1996, technology in gaming was undergoing a rapid evolution. Carmack's Quake engine was, at the time, the apex predator of that evolution, a massive leap forward in both 3D and adaptable technology, so much so that aspects of its code still live within the engines of various games to this date. That being said, the console market had been on an upswing for some time before this. While not as versatile as the PC market, see the various ports of Doom as a reference, 3D technology and gaming consoles had bounded up and over what the PC market could do. Then, Quake came along. Wizardry of that caliber does not go unnoticed by other mages, so too did Quake catch the attention of companies such as Sega, Sony, and Nintendo. First-person shooters on consoles of the time were not unheard of, but they were clunky, awkward, and not nearly as fluid as their PC counterparts. Where once developers of computer games had struggled with parallax scrolling for platformers, now console developers struggled with frame rates and intuitive control schemes for first-person shooters. Still, this did not keep them from trying. Console ports of Doom had already seen some success on platforms such as Super Nintendo, Atari Jaguar, and Sony PlayStation. With id Software's latest and greatest action-packed foray, it felt like almost a given that ports of Quake would arrive on consoles. Quake for the Sega Saturn released on December 2nd, 1997, developed by Lobotomy Software and published by Sega of America. At this point, Lobotomy Software was best known for their previous Saturn game, a first-person shooter titled Power Slave. Founded in 1993, Lobotomy Software had originally created Power Slave while using the Build engine, to be published by 3D Realms. At that point in time, the game had gone under the working title Ruins: Return of the Gods. However, 3D Realms ended up dropping the game, and Lobotomy found a new publisher in Playmates Interactive Entertainment. While the PC version of the game was built in Build, the Saturn and PlayStation versions were constructed using Lobotomy's in-house engine, dubbed Slave Driver. Lobotomy's technology was able to create a fully 3D world optimized specifically for Sega Saturn hardware, and the Saturn version of Power Slave released in September of 1996, only a few months after the release of Quake. It might seem a little strange that the Saturn port of Quake would release a year and a half after the debut of the PC original, and, on top of that, so close to the debut of Quake 2 on PC. There are a few reasons to account for this delay. Number 1. GT Interactive, who published the retail version of Quake for the PC, had been trying to get a Saturn port off the ground for longer than intended. The Saturn's technology was notorious for being difficult to work with, and after mounting frustrations, GT released the Saturn publishing rights over to Sega. Number 2. Sega ended up having their own hangups working with the game. Dissatisfied with their in-house development team, Sega then turned to Lobotomy, impressed with the studio's work on Power Slave. They were so impressed that Sega contracted Lobotomy to develop not one, but 2 Saturn ports of recent shooter classics, Quake and then Duke Nukem 3D. Both of them would be entirely rebuilt from the ground up using Lobotomy's Slave Driver engine. Thus, Saturn Quake was born, and what a strange, beautiful, frustrating Frankenstein of a port it turned out to be. I've used a number of film analogies to describe the general vibes of Quake content covered in the video thus far, and Saturn Quake is no exception. How I would best describe it, however, would be as the video game tie-in for a popular horror film. Since the birth of home consoles, video games based on movies were not uncommon, nor were they commonly good. Some exceptions existed, of course, but for the most part, the film tie-in video games looked and felt like haphazard versions of the blockbusters released into theaters, based on early concept art or scripts or first footage. This would lead to the tie-in games aesthetically operating slightly to the left of how the film looked or sounded. Perhaps the best example would be Street Fighter. In 1991, Street Fighter II dominated arcades. 3 years later, in 1994, Street Fighter the movie launched into theaters with characters that somewhat looked and sounded like the characters from the iconic video game. Then, in 1995, Street Fighter the movie, the game, landed on consoles, a difficult experiment by any means. This video game, based on a movie, based on a video game, was forced to differentiate itself from the animated visuals of the original, and thus turned to digitized actors for the characters, a technique ironically pioneered by Street Fighter II's strongest competitor, Mortal Kombat. That's how Saturn Quake feels. Saturn Quake looks and sounds like Quake, and yet it's just a little off, like someone had played Quake, then immediately turned around and set about recreating the game from memory. Thus far in the video, everything examined around Quake has been built in the Quake engine using Quake assets. The remaster, as well as Dimension of the machine, utilizes Night Dive's versatile Kex engine to recreate the engine and assets, but with the purpose of being as accurate to the source material as possible. Lobotomy's Saturn Quake has none of that. Imagine if someone took a piece of media, scooped all of the guts out of it, handed you the remaining shell, and asked you to restuff it as though it were a Build-A-Bear. Changes within abound. Weapons in the game are not fully 3D as they are on PC. Instead, animated sprites based off of the original weapon models. Grenades have a floatier arc and bounce less compared to the original, something that would go unnoticed unless one were familiar with the original. Changed as well is the difficulty selection screen. Before, there were 3 options. Now, only 2, normal and easy, alongside a well-hidden nightmare selection. Don't let the game fool you into thinking that easy is the baby's option. Normal is a strikingly difficult experience, something which forced me to back down and restart on easy. Easy difficulty, I found, carried many of the same monster placements as the original Quake had on normal. Where I had locked in with Dimension of the Past, this game is just fucking hard on normal and requires the player to complete each map in one go, only able to save between levels. Couple those elements with clunky Saturn controls, and getting good starts to get old real fast. Lobotomy's efforts, however, deserve praise. Certainly, at first glance, the world of the game is much darker than even the original. I had to close my curtains and leave the light off in my office while playing in order to clearly make out half of what I was seeing on screen. But this provides the opportunity for some excellent lighting effects to take prominence throughout. Slip gates glow with a sinister, ominous red. The acid vomit of the scrags glows a putrid green. Explosions blossom in orange. Runes at the end of each chapter emit an eerie purple glow, a nice little touch to make them feel more potently evil. Underwater, the texture work is stunning, with moving shadows drawn across surfaces to simulate light coming down through the ripples. Far more impactful than simply throwing a colored filter over the screen and calling it a day. Atmospherically speaking, the world of Saturn Quake stands in stark contrast to its counterpart, emitting the same aura that I experienced as a teenager while playing Resident Evil 2. Dangerous, murky, tense. This is a horror game through and through, dark and gothic, taking full advantage of the medieval aspects of the game's design in the effort of crafting a sense of unease for the player. Lobotomy was able to secure the original sound effects, though altered slightly, so regardless of the visual differences, and there are many, the game still sounds basically the same, adding to the uncanny sensation that this is, and yet isn't, Quake. It even somehow secured the 9 Inch Nails soundtrack, probably due to the fact that the game is disc-based, so the music remains on the disc. It really does feel like an exec at Sega said, "What if we make a video game based on Quake?" And Lobotomy said, "But Quake is a game already." And then the exec said, "Yeah, but what if we made a video game based on Quake?" While the game clearly looks and sounds separate from the original, what truly sets it apart and makes the effort interesting are the wholly unique aspects of the game. While it should be made notable that Lobotomy recreated every one of the maps from the main campaign, all 4 secret maps were jettisoned in favor of creating 4 brand new secret maps exclusive to this port. Purgatorium, Hell's Eyrie, the Colosseum, and Watery Grave. On vibes alone, these 4 maps are exceptional Quake experiences. Purgatorium is my personal favorite, set in a black pyramid with underground canals and rain falling from an evil green sky. Rain in a Quake map is something I've never seen before, and was so shockingly different that I nearly forgot to play for about half a minute. Hell's Eyrie holds a similar moment of awe in the beginning, the open sky above, dotted with distant stars against the darkness. The rest of the map is comprised of what can only be described as the treetop Ewok village from Return of the Jedi strung over a bottomless black void. I liked this map despite how clunky and sometimes frustrating it was to play through it using the Saturn controls, which tasks the D-pad with moving and turning and the L and R triggers for strafing. Not exactly delicate or gentle on moving across narrow wooden bridges, which means starting the map entirely anew should you fall. The Colosseum, meanwhile, is a delightfully tongue-in-cheek exercise where the player is forced to choose a monster to fight against a computer-chosen monster in a mock wrestling match. The victor will then turn to attack the player, forcing them to defend themselves, and it's on to round 2. Win 3 rounds in a row, and you're free to go. If the computer wins a round, your wins are reset. Lobotomy treats the concept with the perfect amount of cheese, centering the map around a wrestling ring bearing the logo QWF, flanked with stadium lights and accompanied by canned audience cheers. Yes, this is silly, but it's gleefully silly. Saturday morning cartoon deathmatch. Choosing the Shambler every time would be pithy. Players are meant to have fun with experimental choices. If you've ever wondered who would win the fight between an ogre and a death knight, now you will, and I guarantee it's not who you think. The final secret map is, unfortunately, one of the worst Quake maps I've ever had the displeasure to experience, but it is only among the worst due to the necessity of the Saturn control scheme. Watery Grave takes place mostly underwater, meaning a whole lot of navigation with the constant ticking clock above the player's head reminding them that Ranger needs to breathe to stay alive. Meanwhile, the map contains multiple pathways that not only require you to swim below the surface, but obstacles that force you to stay there. This is where the control scheme works against the game. Up until this point, I'd gotten along fine without having to utilize the look button very much, thanks in part to the game's generous auto-aim. Looking up or down requires holding a button, then moving the D-pad to look, and releasing the look button in order to be able to move again. Since I didn't need this very much, I didn't use it. In fact, I turned on the option called Look Spring, which forces the camera to snap to center whenever the player starts to move. With Look Spring on, Watery Grave is close to impossible to beat. Sinking below the surface at the normal rate of submersion guarantees that Ranger will start to drown long before the player can reach the next objective. But if the player were to adjust the viewpoint to look down, for example, Ranger will then swim downwards faster. This requires turning off Look Spring. Okay then, but that also means stopping underwater to adjust the camera in order to swim up or down faster, meaning precious seconds of wasted breath. Not okay. Ultimately, after several attempts and finally consulting a walkthrough, it took me a good 45 minutes to complete this map. If it had mouse and keyboard controls, Watery Grave would not be as frustrating as it is. But as it is, it's damn near frustrating enough to rage quit the entire experience. Intrepid modders have recreated these maps for Quake on PC, and they can be experienced by curious gamers who don't want to deal with ancient clunky controls. That being said, said maps don't contain the same vibes without the rain effects, or skybox effects, or underwater effects. Are these neat? You bet they are. Are they worth booting up the Saturn just to play? That, potentially, is a hearty no. Of course, Saturn Quake is subsisting on more than just these maps for those curious of the experience. Aside from the graphical revamp and the unique maps, Saturn Quake also contains original key art created for the loading screens. I'm a big fan of these. Each episode gets its own loading screen between maps, although episodes 1 and 3 share the same screen, and each episode shows a unique ending screen once the rune has been captured. I'm particularly fond of episode 4's loading screen, which presents a melee fight between Ranger and a Shambler, and that episode's ending screen provides a victorious Ranger poised to behead that goddamn Shambler. Victory never felt so sweet. But the title of best loading screen has to go to the one seen as you enter a secret level. The image of Ranger fills the screen, seen with a finger to his mouth, shushing the player as though to say, hey, keep this to yourself. Perfection. Tongue-in-cheek, wink and nod, perfection. The final curio that Saturn Quake brings to the table is the track playing over the end credits. While the rest of the game utilizes the instrumental Nine Inch Nails score, the end credits features a song titled B7 by artist Sonic Mayhem. Sonic Mayhem should already be a familiar name to Quake enthusiasts, as he made the soundtrack for Quake 2, and also provided multiple tracks for Quake 3 Arena alongside industrial band Frontline Assembly. B7 is a fascinating artifact, one not easily found on physical media. Sonic Mayhem originally produced the song as part of an alternative soundtrack to Quake, titled Methods of Destruction, released in October of 1996. Players could purchase a copy of the CD directly from the artist and then slip it into their CD-ROM drive to listen to while playing the game. Looking at the website for the album, a quote from John Romero can be seen praising the project.
The CD rocks. It perfectly matches the mood and attitude of Quake.
Quite the endorsement. Somehow in all my years as an aficionado of Quake, I've never heard of this album. Thankfully, due in part to my experience here, I've corrected that mistake and have added Methods of Destruction to my rotating lineup of gaming music. One of my favorite aspects about the history of gaming are all the interconnected threads from project to project. And in this case, Sonic Mayhem composing an unofficial soundtrack for Quake 1, one track of which appearing here in Saturn Quake, means that Sonic Mayhem has, in fact, had music appear officially in each entry of the id Software Quake trilogy. That's pretty fucking cool in my book. Saturn Quake is a fascinating artifact of its time. Does it play well today? God, no, not at all. The graphics are sometimes muddy and indistinct, the control scheme is awkward to work around, and the fraught difficulty, combined with the requirement of playing each map start to finish in order to save, feels archaic, and not in the best way. But when held up in context, this is a remarkable achievement in console gaming. Lobotomy Software truly understood the technical aspects of the Sega Saturn, and wrung every ounce of power out of that console's hardware in order to craft what is essentially a handmade Quake experience. Nostalgia is a strange thing that softens gamer perspectives on older experiences. These graphics feel like home, like something I would have played on a console back in 1996, and playing it now sends me flying at warp speed back to the summer that I was 13. And as a one-off experience, Saturn Quake is one that I'm glad to have gone through, but it is a bit of a slog, and for that, I probably won't return to it any time in the future. Quake 64, on the other hand, is a goddamn masterpiece, and I absolutely hate it. Calling it a masterpiece is, of course, hyperbole. Calling anything on the N64 a masterpiece outside of Super Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time is, let's face it, a stretch. The N64, despite being my favorite console of that generation, was a flawed machine that meant well and performed to that extent. There are titles for the system which stand the test of time, but many that don't. Whether or not Quake 64 is a title that withstands the test is purely subjective. But of the two console ports of Quake, not only is this one my favorite, it's also a ruthless, streamlined version of Quake that serves to highlight the audacity and viciousness of Quake's design ethics. It's also been remembered the most fondly, as seen in the port's inclusion of the 2021 remaster as a free add-on. Released on March 24th, 1998, Quake 64 was developed and published by Midway Games, using a heavily modified version of the Quake engine. After Midway's production of Doom 64, id Software was so impressed with the quality of that port that they immediately granted permission to Midway to get started on one for Quake as well, specifically requesting that the programming team from Doom 64 work on this new project. Quake 64 was originally slated to release in the latter part of 1997, just like the Saturn port, but Midway chose to delay release to provide the development team more time to refine the deathmatch components. In order to get the game to perform well on the limited storage capacity of the N64 cartridge, multiple cuts had to be made. To begin with, gone is the episode selection screen in favor of a linear map-to-map experience. Players now move through each stage one after another, with no breaks, limited here as with the Saturn version to only saving progress at the end of a map. Fascinatingly, this method still includes the episode intermission text whenever a player acquires a new rune, delivering the story piecemeal. After these, the player is then deposited into the next map in order, their previous weapons stripped back down to the shotgun and the axe as though they were starting a brand new episode. 6 maps have been cut from the proceedings in order to facilitate these changes, some of which held access to the secret maps in the original format, so the slip gates to said secret maps have, in places, been moved around. Certain enemy encounters have also been changed, such as zombies appearing where rotfish once were, death knights being replaced with ogres in certain situations, and the Vor are introduced much earlier. Despite these alterations, Quake 64's gameplay feels remarkably unchanged. Some sound effects have been replaced with subtle alterations, some maps have been altered in the slightest of ways to adjust for more limited movement, but the combat, the animations, and especially the grenade launcher all stand exactly as they did in the PC original. Graphically, however, much has changed. Much like Doom 64 before it, Quake 64 takes advantage of the N64's colored lighting palette with baked-in light sources that heighten the atmosphere. Seething reds, grim blues, pallid yellows. Where Saturn Quake held tight to creating the darkness in order to show off their lighting effects, Quake 64 dials the brightness up, playing not with grim shadows to craft atmosphere, but rather with the specific lighting surrounding the environments to enhance mood. And what a mood. Perhaps I've used the word sinister one too many times throughout the course of this video, but of all the sinistery auras of all the sinister Quake games and variants, Quake 64 is perhaps the most sinister, because it exists at a liminal junction between what is known of Quake and what is unknown of this specific port. Backing up for just a moment, when I sat down to play Quake 64 initially, I did so immediately after having played Saturn Quake. The prospect of diving yet again into yet another console Quake game where I had to complete each map from start to finish before being granted the whimsy of saving my game felt just a little too daunting in the moment. Saturn Quake never felt insurmountable once I tuned the difficulty to one more suited to my desires, but here, Quake 64 stood true to the original's difficulty sliders. There's no difficulty hub this time around, rather a simple selection from the main menu, which, lo and behold, displays Nightmare right there should someone be bold enough to choose it. After testing normal difficulty and affirming that it was, in fact, exactly the same as on the PC, I decided, fuck it, man. I'd played close to 40 hours of Quake in different forms by this point, and I deserved a bit of a break. Besides, if the Saturn port's controls were awkward to work with, then the N64 controls were, by comparison, completely borked. The center stick drives Ranger forward and turns left and right, with strafing relegated to the left and right C buttons, and the jump button assigned to the down C button. Sure, there are options to rebind the controls as I desire, but I was just not having it. In my humble opinion, I'd earned the right to avoid having to play through each map start to finish all over again. So I turned once again to the remaster. The remaster features Quake 64 as an add-on map pack, with a CRT filter to finalize the illusion of playing the game as it was in 1998. This filter is shockingly good at emulating the look and feel of sitting just a little too close to the TV back in my teenage years. Turn off enhanced models, turn off model interpolation, turn off dynamic lighting to really fine-tune the retro experience, and from a visual standpoint, it might as well be the same. A little test was all I needed to confirm that the remaster of Quake 64 held the same enemy placement, the same colored lighting placement, and with that, it was off to the races. What a victory lap. Cruising through Quake 64 in the remaster with the smooth control scheme was everything I wanted in that moment. Night Dive's clear reverence for all things Quake once again shines through in this loving recreation of the look and feel of Quake 64. I played this version on normal difficulty in order to continue my emulation of the Quake 64 experience, and you know what? It was a fine time. Just kind of nice to play through a game without meeting the same kind of resistance I was accustomed to. And by this point, with my accumulated knowledge through playing OG Quake, the remaster, and Saturn Quake, I was hitting secrets and hidden items left and right, and I felt goddamn near unstoppable. But therein lie the rub. Something was wrong, and it took me about 3/4 of the way through this run to fully grasp at it. This didn't hurt. Not nearly enough. Every Quake run thus far had hurt in its own special way, been akin to a special type of film horror in its own special way, but remastered Quake 64 didn't hurt. It felt good. Too good. Perhaps the reason was the chosen difficulty of normal. I could start over and bump it up a notch, but no, something inherent was missing. And then it hit me. Dimension of the Past had tested me in ways that I hadn't expected, had told me to move, and yet I persisted. Quake 64 had offered the simple challenge of proceeding through each map in one go, and I balked at it. On normal difficulty. I had deflected and chosen the lesser path through a gentler version, and so this could not stand. It seemed to me that Quake 64 could not be more difficult than Dimension of the Past, and so with that, I once again returned to Midway's console port in the effort of completing my Quake journey from start to finish. Quake 64 is not only more difficult than Dimension of the Past, it is single-handedly the most difficult Quake experience I have crossed in the course of making this video. I was cursing, yelling, groaning, and moaning all throughout. Each death in-game hurt me worse than any death in Doom Eternal that I have endured. At various points, my children would come knock on my office door to check and see if I was still mentally stable, walking in to discover their father with his head in his hands, a pink fiend standing over his digital corpse. And that was just the halfway mark. By the time I reached the pain maze, no consolation could undo the despair from each death state at the hands of yet another fucking spawn. Quake 64's difficulty is not artificially produced. If anything, it is the result of removing the simple player agency of fluid controls and the ability to quicksave. That's all. Retained here are the levels as originally conducted by the staff at id Software, with minor alterations by Midway. Some of these hemmed corners have indescribable butterfly effects later on down the road in the game, such as denying the player early access to weaponry, which would make certain combat encounters much more bearable. Removing the sewage system, E4M1 for example, denies the player access to the nail gun, meaning said nail gun is not in the player's inventory upon landing in the Tower of Despair, E4M2. Quake 64 cuts straight to the Tower of Despair, meaning the player must then struggle against a Vor, followed immediately by a Shambler, with their most powerful weapon being the double-barreled shotgun. Sure, access to a pentagram of protection and a nail gun exist within the perimeter of the Shambler's environment, but if the player is killed before they can find those, then it's back to the start once more. Slight alterations, very slight, fundamentally alter the player's options when it comes to combat. Beyond this are the controls. Despite my initial protest, I chose to rebind my controller options after all, using the center stick to move forward and backward, but also to strafe left and right, setting my ability to turn Ranger with the left and right C buttons. Much easier to deal with, all well and good. But while this setup offers far better control over Ranger than the default settings, we're still facing Quake enemies lifted directly from the PC, seemingly unaltered in either speed or resiliency. Fiends are the truest enemy here in this game. Their leap attacks cleave your health in half, then their claw swipes finish off the remaining portions in seconds. One thing Saturn Quake had in terms of player agency was that the nail gun could stun lock enemies, particularly the Fiend, something that didn't exist in PC Quake, which means that there's no stun locking in Quake 64 either. One Fiend is all it takes to end a single good run. One Ogre is enough to end a run. Depending on the circumstance, one fucking zombie is enough to end a run. Zero guarantees exist in this version of the game. Wits, caution, and mindful trigger fingers are required to see the game through. However, the game's atmosphere is working overtime to reduce the player's cool-headedness down to a minimum. This Quake truly is a horror experience, just like those that came before it, but rather than comparisons to a film, Quake 64 feels like a prestige format horror series. Slow, methodical, liminal. I would even go so far as to say that Quake 64 is best compared to analog horror. That's how it hurts. It lures in the player with the prospect of familiarity, then slowly distorts and twists that prospect into something unfamiliar enough to root terror deep within the nervous system. Analog horror commonly operates within the found footage subgenre, wrapped around the notion of a lost film or lost video game, found and then displayed for the audience to witness become misshapen and warped. Something known becomes something unknown. Through subtle manipulations, the audience only recognizes if paying careful attention. Thus, Quake 64, even from the opening level, operates on the notion of escalating an unsettling atmosphere through alteration, shifts in color palette, skybox texture, and enemy placement. If you were to play Quake and then Quake 64 back to back, the sensation would be immediate. If you only played Quake 64, however, the effect would remain instead subconscious. It could be argued, of course, that since Saturn Quake makes attempts to emulate Quake while looking so distinctly different, that it should fall under the analog horror category instead, not this one. But it's because Saturn Quake is visually clearly so distinct that it removes it from this consideration. Quake 64, because of how similar it feels at first, and how it slowly unravels into a deadly alternate, hews so much closer into analog territory. Midway's Doom 64 team was expert at creating circumstances such as these. Where Doom 64 could have been a straightforward port of Doom, it instead became an original entry in the Doom series, transformed from a blistering sprint out of hell into a Sisyphean slog back into its depths. That sensation of descent is what Quake 64 then excels at. Perhaps it feels trite to call this port Quake the Back Rooms, but viewing this footage, it's hard to not make that comparison. Look at the color grading, the texture mapping, the movement. Quake 64 is one of the rare N64 games that has a visual filter which can be turned off in the options menu, reducing smoothed over textures into something crunchier, grainier. That lower fidelity adds to the uncanniness. Leaving the filter on gives the proceedings a bit of a mask, making it more difficult to sense that something is wrong until deeper in. Perhaps that would be better in terms of what the game is doing, but if you really just want to get what's happening here, turn the filter off. That's what I did. Quake already held the elements of entering a world previously unseen by humans, marked by traps, horrific creatures, and medieval architecture, all backed by the oppressive Nine Inch Nails soundtrack. Quake 64 takes all of these elements and not only doubles down on that sensation, but transfigures it into something even more unsettling and alien, backed this time by a thoroughly uncomfortable ambient score by Aubrey Hodges. Aubrey Hodges is a name that should be more well known by first-person shooter enthusiasts. Prior to Quake 64, he composed the soundtracks for Doom and Final Doom on the PlayStation, as well as for Doom 64. If visuals alone aren't enough to sway the audience into believing that Quake 64 operates within analog horror constraints, then the discomfort of Hodges' soundtrack ought to seal the deal. It is brutally uncomfortable. Trent Reznor's music for the original exudes madness and instability, like fingernails gently dragging along your spine, slowly digging deeper and deeper as you fight towards release. Aubrey Hodges offers no escalation, no resolution within the maps. It is genuinely unlike anything I've ever heard in a video game. Utilizing samples of sound effects from the game, Hodges builds a wall of low energy sound, layering cavernous, ambient noise. Sometimes it sounds like an asymmetric heartbeat. Other times it sounds like a wolf howling, except it can't be a wolf as there are no wolves here. Sometimes high-pitched wails scrape along the audio. One track includes a foreign scream that appears at inopportune moments. When I first heard this, I briefly froze in my tracks and spun around, desperate to discover whatever the hell it was that made that noise. Being as familiar as I am with Quake, I know the various sound effects, I know what the different monsters sound like. So to hear something I did not recognize while playing this game was a chilling experience. Once I realized it was the soundtrack, I didn't feel any better, because that meant it could happen again. Not only could it happen again, it could unnerve me just as harshly as it had before, but no doubt in different ways. Hodges weaves his soundscape together to sound as though you're standing in the middle of a great cave, a world where the sky and the water and the walls all breathe together. An old, living world, one slightly to the right of one that you already know. And it knows you're here. For a slight relief from the discomfort, Hodges delivers more traditional tunes along the lines of classic Nine Inch Nails tracks with the main menu theme, the post-level wrap-up theme, and the end credits. Each time the level complete theme came on, I breathed a heavy sigh of not relief, but refortification. Just enough catharsis from realizing that I had made it, but just enough foreboding to remind me that there was more to go. It's fascinating how different the menu themes are from the ambient world tracks, like the menu themes are kind of mocking the player in a way. Ah, you think you're playing a video game with music by Trent Reznor, they say, as they come back around, dabbing your sweaty forehead with a cloth, and then, into the next level, returns the warbling and dissonant scrambling of sound effect samples stretched into the idea of an elder world breathing around you. It's beautifully horrible, liminal, and uncomfortable. It truly defines the entirety of the Quake 64 experience, a masterpiece that rivals the original soundtrack. Over on Bandcamp, Hodges provided some insight into the creation of the soundtrack.
In 1998, Quake was brought to Nintendo 64 by Midway Games. The challenge for me, from the audio perspective, was in how to deliver an aggressive and edgy sound using very low-quality small samples. I used less samples in the music and reused sound effects as instrument samples at times. I really like how it came together, and the game is one of my favorite works. I had always wondered what could have been if there were less restrictions, so I recently created 2 new remix tracks to find out. One last note, in some cases I had purposely used distortion and sonic degradation in the tracks. No, your speakers are not screwed up. I am.
Is Quake 64 perfect? Not even a little bit. The controls tend towards awkward, as do any and all control schemes for first-person shooters on any console ever made. No one handheld controller has ever been able to capture the precision of mouse and keyboard, and here it is especially notable. Aiming feels as unintuitive as it gets, with the left and right turning, moving always a few more pixels than you want. Fortunately, auto-aim here is generous and helps balance the difference. Much like Saturn Quake, looking up and down requires holding a button to do so, eating precious seconds at times when an ogre or shambler is bearing down on your position. But these inconveniences feel less burdensome and more weighed against the player as they attempt to wrestle control for themselves amongst a hopeless situation. As uncomfortable as the controls may be, they add to the experience rather than detract. Yes, I was frustrated. Yes, I was in anguish. And yes, I was nearly beaten back by the game as I rolled into the final 3 maps. But what it serves is to highlight just how mean Quake really is. Enemy placement, enemy damage output, level design, weapon damage, movement, all of it constructed so as to push hard back against the player. We the player, as we enter into contract with this game, are asked to be resilient. Certainly within the construct of combat and the limitations presented by smaller enemy counts within maps. Holding down the trigger and praying that our ammo reserves will hold out longer than the enemy HP will is a crucial aspect of Quake. I'm sure some in the comments will enlighten me as to how that isn't so, but I defy you. Quake on hard or nightmare is brutally hazardous and will test even the strongest player. Quake 64 on normal looks down from on high and says, "Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair." But only because it streamlines down to the essence that which John Romero, American McGee, Tim Willits, and Sandy Peterson assembled with their level layouts in the first place. One life, one shot. Or it's back to the beginning. If that doesn't hurt, then I don't know what does. At this junction, we've come full circle. From the Lovecraftian horror of Quake, to the video nasty horror of Scourge of Armagon, the action horror of Dissolution of Eternity, the scraping dread of Dimension of the Past, the apathetic cosmic horror of Dimension of the Machine, the video game terror of Quake Saturn, and finally, the analog horror of Quake 64. Over the course of 30 years, Quake has proven time and again that it is adaptable, shape-shifting, containing multitudes even while not holding the same themes, narrative, or even gameplay. And that concept was proven here, with the original game and with each of its expansions and ports. All wildly different, all presenting true to the theme that, in fact, everything hurts. How it hurts and where it hurts and what we do in response to that might change at times. After all, not all pain is equal. Sometimes we can ignore pain. Sometimes all we feel is pain. Quake 1 was imbued with a sense of agony and of ache, no doubt unintentionally, but clearly as a direct result of the environment within which the game was created. That kind of trauma does not hold still. It gets passed from one to another, generational, reformed and reshaped and re-experienced. Earlier in the video, I spoke on how movement in the remaster feels different. It doesn't embody the same quick directional strafing of the original game, which takes away from the franticness of the goings-on. Here, at this point in my writing, I've now gone back and given the remaster another playthrough, experimenting with some of the other expansions and how they feel with those controls. What a difference! Smoothly gliding from one environment to the next, confidently in control of both my aim and my footsteps, makes an incredible difference. I still value the original control scheme, but after immersing myself in the madness of Quake's hectic horrors across 4 expansions, the modern controls just feel good. It's nice. It's so nice to just play a goddamn game sometimes. Perhaps after taking note of the ache and the hurt of the production of the game and the subsequent vibes imbued within Quake, I just wanted this all to be as coarse as possible. In the case of Dimension of the Past, a little too much, but I digress. Now, replaying through the game once more with the expansions just for my own sake, that comfiness mixed with the sweatiness of Quake makes it just slightly more enjoyable. It honestly feels refreshing and makes me want to go back in for yet another round. Yes, everything still hurts, and the original hurt can still be experienced within source ports, but it doesn't have to hurt so much if we don't need it to. On a note of coincidence, recently, in April of 2026, 9 Inch Nails debuted a brand new album titled 9 Inch Noise. This was done in tandem with DJ and producer Boys Noise, who's previously remixed the soundtrack to the movie Challengers, which was crafted by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, and toured with 9 Inch Nails on the Peel It Back tour. During said tour, Boys Noise would partner with Reznor and Ross to perform remixed and reworked electronica versions of 9 Inch Nails staples, which then led to this album in question. Certainly, the new remixes are wildly different from the original cuts, songs which I've spent the better part of, 30 years listening to. And yet, the production, the energy, the sheer bliss of Trent screaming over rave beats is joyous. By going back to the past, 9 Inch Nails have rediscovered a desire to create more music, to tour again, louder than ever. In much the same way, Quake's resurgence began with a look back in time before reworking the controls, enhancing the graphics, and presenting the old under not just a new coat of paint, but a lovingly done rebuilding of the entire experience. Still, however, where is Quake today? Despite multiple sequels, spin-offs, ports, and mods, Quake has quietly faded into the shadow of its older cousin, Doom. Doom has dominated the convention named after Quake year after year since at least 2014, highlighting 3 AAA titles and 2 episodes of DLC. Doom is the word of the day now, not Quake. And yet we have the fanbase rabid with desire. The success of the remasters of Quake 1 and 2, alongside fan speculations on which title may or may not be the next remaster, should indicate to executives that yes, we are here. We are willing to spend money. All we need is a game that is not Quake Champions. Fan outcry at the revelation of the Elder World levels from Doom the Dark Ages consumed boomer shooter circles for months, as talking heads were convinced that Dark Ages really was a Quake game before id Software added a thin coating of Doom over the works. In October of 2025, YouTuber Elephant's Doing Crack published a video on Quake 4, in which he revealed new details of a cancelled expansion to Quake 4, titled The Awakening, details which at that time had been unknown to the general public, even though fans knew of the expansion's existence in the past. Then, in April of 2026, YouTuber Justin Marshall began uploading footage of an alpha build of Awakening, found on an old computer he had purchased for presumably spare parts. Quake fans exploded over this bevy of previously hidden content. As of this writing, rumors, as they are wont to do, are currently circulating that Night Dive has the files for Awakening and are planning to release the content with a remaster of Quake 4 itself. Whether or not this is true, at this point in time, is anyone's guess, but it certainly would be nice to get an announcement of previously unplayable Quake at the convention which is named after Quake. Perhaps, now 5 years after the 25th anniversary, Machine Games will deliver yet another Quake expansion in celebration. Maybe id Software will simply add Quake skins to the Dark Ages so that Doom fans can cosplay Quake once again without any benefit of a new game. Who knows? But to add fuel to the speculation of anything new or noteworthy, during the course of the production of this video, it was announced that John Romero, John Carmack, Tom Hall, and Adrian Carmack would all be appearing together at QuakeCon 2026. What goings-on could contribute to the assembly of the original id Software development team? From where I'm sitting now, in May of 2026, I cannot tell you. As usual, all we can do is wait and hope. Quake is 30, and that's weird. But what's less weird is why fans have held onto this little game for the course of 3 decades. Still, to this day, it remains unknowable, undefinable. I have my opinions on what Quake 1 is and how it should be treated, but that doesn't make me objectively right. I am, at the end of the day, simply a fan. Having a YouTube channel doesn't make me any smarter or more insightful than anyone else. If you agree with me, then I'm happy to know I'm not alone. If you disagree with me, well, that's what the comment section is generally used for. But one thing that can be agreed on as fans of Quake is that we don't want to see this part of the franchise die quietly. We know the end of Ranger's story. He eventually finds himself in the Arena Eternal, and he never escapes. A tragic ending, but one that's fitting. After battling the madness and the ache for so many years, he finally becomes lost to it. That's as Lovecraftian as it gets. But what about what happened to him before the arena? Was the dimension of the machine his final stop before drifting into the void? How many other quantum leaps did he take before the Vadrigar took him into the arena? It seems as though there's always room for one more story in the Dreamlands, and hopefully id Software, or Machine Games, or perhaps a different developer, will at last pick up the reins for a 2016 style reboot and allow players to finally return to the worlds birthed by id Software 30 years ago. And hopefully, it still hurts. Thank you all so much for joining me on this journey. Originally, this video was meant to be a quick look at the franchise of Quake as a whole and to speculate on where it might be going in the future. While this may have turned into something much larger than that without my intention, it certainly hasn't been unwelcome to finally dive deep into the depths of Quake for the first time. It's strange how we as gamers can believe we know a game, only to constantly discover and rediscover new aspects of it. As the Quake dad, it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to share all of this with you. For those of you interested in supporting my channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the pinned comment below, as well as links to information relevant to the rest of this video. For now, however, sit up straight, stand up and stretch a little because this was a very long video, and as always, make sure you stay hydrated. I'll see you soon.